Welcome, everybody. We are pleased to have you with us this afternoon. My name's Jim Schwartz. I'm Director of Research Agronomy and Practical Farm Research here at Beck's Hybrids. Then we're going to kick off for the next 40 minutes and talk about putting $100 back in your pocket. But I'm going to start with this. Who is the greatest basketball coach of all time? And I'm going to give you a clue. It's not Bobby Knight, okay? Who is the greatest basketball coach of all time? Anybody want to venture a guess? Who? Okay, that's a great guess. That's a great guess. Coach K is a good guess. Who'd you say? A good guess. I'm going to go with the Purdue guy, though. I'm going with John Wooden, okay? All right, now, here's the thing about John Wooden. John Wooden won 10 national championships, 7 in a row at one point in time, all right? He had rosters full of high school and college All-Americans. And at the beginning of every basketball season, John Wooden did one thing with his team. He sat them down and he talked to them and showed them how to put on their socks and tie their shoes. That is a true story every year. And these guys are like, we just won our 5th national championship in a row. Why are we doing this? Because John Wooden learned as a child from his grandfather that when you plow behind the mules, if you put on your socks and you had a fold in your sock, you'd get a blister. And then you wouldn't be able to plow behind the mules anymore. So he learned at a very young age that doing the basic, fundamental, simple things mattered a lot. Okay, now I'll ask you, who's the greatest football coach of all time? And it's not Bill Belichick, okay? Who's the greatest football coach of all time? I'll give you a clue. The Super Bowl trophy is named after him. Vince Lombardi. After winning his first world championship with a roster full of all pros, Vince Lombardi approached his team and he held out a football to them and he said, "Gentlemen, this is a football." Well, what was Vince Lombardi trying to tell his guys? Focus on the basics. Start simple, focus on the things that matter most, okay? So, I get a lot of questions. In Practical Farm Research, we've done hundreds of studies every year, and people ask me about what should I focus on, and I'm going to focus on something simple today, but I'm going to start with telling you that if you'll focus on tile and lime, you'll do better. Now that's not real glorious, it's not real fantastic, right? But this is tying your shoes and putting your socks on right. Well, why? Why tile and lime? Well, we like to talk a lot when we think about pH, right? When we think about, hey, what's the nutrient availability? And this is why when you see the green, fertility is most available at 6.5 to 7, all important. But I want to spend a little time talking about it from a different perspective. So pH, you know what pH stands for? It's log of hydrogen. So hydroxyl groups, OH, hydroxyl groups are alkaline. Hydrogen creates acidic conditions. The amount of hydrogen in your soil. It drives a lot of functions in your soil. A lot. The one I want to focus on is the one in the upper left there for just a minute, and that's mineralization of organic matter. I want you to look at this chart with me. This represents about 3.5% organic matter soil. What it shows you is the amount of fertility that exists at any one given time in 3.5% organic matter soil. So look at that, 3,500 pounds of nitrogen, tens of thousands of pounds of potassium are there today. These soils out here have this. So you're sitting there going, well, wait a minute. Why in the world am I spending time and money and energy fertilizing my crops? Because we can't access this all at once. So most nutrients lie in one of 3 pools. The unavailable pool, which it's a silica form or it's part of an organic structure. Then you have the slowly available pool and the readily available pool. When you soil test basically for the slowly and readily available pool. But the question is, what if we could do things to move those nutrients more quickly from the slowly and unavailable pool into that readily available pool? And a lot of that will come with mineralization of organic matter. As you mineralize organic matter, it basically burns up and releases nutrients into your soil, some of these nutrients. Well, there are 4 factors that really impact mineralization of organic matter: temperature, pH, moisture, and oxygen. Well, if you think about temperature, moisture, pH, and oxygen, how many of them are tied to tile and lime? All 4 of them. All 4 of those things are heavily impacted by tile and lime. So if we can mineralize our soils more quickly, by improving our tile and lime, and incrementally improving temperature, moisture, pH, and oxygen in our soils, we can improve them greatly. In 2018, University of Illinois went out, 4% organic matter soils, and they started sampling their zero nitrogen plots. So they had some tests and they sampled where they had not applied any nitrogen. In June, they sampled 1 foot depth. Anybody want to get 2018, by the way, is one of the best years for mineralization of organic matter that I've seen in 37 years. Anybody want to guess how many pounds of nitrogen they were finding? They were finding 170 to 190 pounds of nitrogen available where they applied zero. Why? Because the temperature, pH, moisture, and oxygen were ideal, and they were mineralizing a lot of organic matter at a 1 foot depth. So if we can improve our mineralization, we can improve our nutrient availability. So what does PFR tell us are some of the opportunities as it relates to tile? Well, we have some trials at 2 of our heavier soil type locations, Effingham, Illinois, London, Ohio. 4-year data would say it's about 25 bushel on corn. I'm not here to tell you what depth you need to apply your tile, what the tile size needs to be, or the width between your tile, the tile runs, because the hydrology of your soils are all different. Excuse me, but what I am telling you is tile can improve your productivity on corn. How about soybeans? Does tile make a difference on soybeans? Yep, about 12 to 14 bushel. That's pretty impactful. And some of that impact can come from the improvement in temperature, moisture, pH, and oxygen of your soils. In fact, if you do the math, that's about $250 an acre. You can do the returns on tile, but you can see that simply doing the basics of putting on our socks and tying our shoes with tile and lime can definitely impact our bottom line. But now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about some success strategies in practical farm research. So in corn and beans, we have 5 success strategies. So we have PFR Proven products and practices. Those are things that we've tested a minimum of 3 years at multiple locations, and have had a positive yield result every year and averaged a positive ROI over those 3 years. There's 105 of those. So then what we did is we said, what are the ones that are just layups? What are the 5 in corn and 5 in beans that we feel like most farmers could benefit from? And so I'm going to talk to you about a few of those today. One is side dress nitrogen. Okay? What happens when you put nitrogen on your soils in any one given year? There's 4 things that can happen. It can be taken up by the plant. That's a good thing. It can be immobilized by carbon in your soil. It can become part of that organic construct. In other words, that unavailable pool I talked about. Or it can be lost. One of those 4 things can happen. Now, how is nitrogen lost? Well, there's one of 4 ways. Surface displacement, you throw a prill on the surface and you get a heavy rainfall, or denitrification, volatilization, or leaching. How many of those methods involve water? All 4. All 4. Now, here's my question. Of the nitrogen that you all apply most years, how much gets taken up by the plant? Most studies would tell you between 40 and 50%. Somewhere between 40 or 50%. Some of it becomes part of the organic construct. Some of it's taken up by the plant. Some of it's lost. Well, if that's the case, then how do we prevent that loss? I took this picture a couple weeks ago here at our farm. We've had a number of heavy rainfall events. I wasn't surprised that we would start seeing this on our farm, start seeing this denitrification. So what can we do to prevent that? One of the ways is side dressing. So here are 4 different methods that we compared to putting all your nitrogen on up front. 4 different ways. All 4 of them, side dress methods, provided quite a bit better profitability as compared to all your nitrogen up front. All side dress methods all work better. Why? I like to think of this as time versus error. Tim Rao, Tim's in the back of the room. Tim, what clothes are you going to be wearing 3 months from today? He has no idea. You know why? Because he doesn't know what the weather's going to be 3 months from today. So let me ask you a question. When you apply your nitrogen, why do you put it all up front? Because you have no idea what the weather's going to be for the next 3 months. I get this question all the time. People ask me, how much nitrogen should I put on? What form should I put it on? When should I put it on? Should I use the stabilizer? My answer is, I can tell you exactly the right answer if you're willing to wait until September. Right? Why? Because then I've accumulated a lot of information. Well, it's the same thing. If you think about that decision point as the time you put on your nitrogen, the further away you get from that decision point, the larger your margin for error. But if I can push that decision point further into the growing season, what's happened from here versus here? I've accumulated information, and information is power. So let me ask you a question. What if this is 2012, and I push this decision further into the growing season? Heaven forbid, 2012, I'm probably going to cut my nitrogen back because I've lost a lot of yield. What if this is 2015 and it's rained pretty much every other day and I've got 30 inches of rain by May? If I haven't made the decision to put all my nitrogen up front, I haven't lost a lot of it. And I also know I probably need to supplement right there. What if it's 2018 and it's the year where we had the best mineralization we've ever had? Likely, I was recommending cut back your nitrogen rates because there's a whole bunch of free nitrogen available to you in your soil. But the point is, by waiting, by pushing that decision point later into the growing season, you accumulate information, and that information is power. Tim, if I asked you in 2 months and 29 days, what clothes are you going to wear? Would you have a better idea? Yeah, he's nodding his head yes. Because why? He's accumulated information. Well, we wanted to figure out how important is placement. So everything I talked about right there was timing. Well, what about placement? Does that matter as it relates to nitrogen? And can I reduce my losses or manage my nitrogen better through placement? So what we did, we applied anhydrous ammonia down the middle of the row, and 4 weeks after we applied it, you can see the corn rows, we went out and we sampled across the row. Sampled across the row 4 weeks later. What did we find? 4 weeks later, so you see where the corn plants are, right? Most of that nitrogen is where? Right in the middle of the row. What form is it in? In the ammonium form. That makes sense 4 weeks later. So then at 8 weeks, we did the same thing. Went back and started sampling across the row to see where was the nitrogen and what form it was in. Interestingly enough, now it's in the nitrate form, which that makes sense. But where is it? It's right in the middle of the row. So let me ask you a question. If you think about a corn plant, for the most part, about 70% of a corn plant's roots lie within 7 inches of that stalk. The vast majority of a corn plant's roots lie within 7 inches of the stalk. If I'm putting my nitrogen over here, and that nitrate is negatively charged, your soil is negatively charged. If I have a 4-inch rainfall or a 3-inch rainfall or a 2-inch rainfall, that'll move that nitrate nitrogen 12, 18 inches down in my soil. If I move that vertically and I've placed it over here, does it make a difference if I've moved it a little closer to the plant? Well, we wanted to find that out as well. So we tested Y drops. And when you look at our data, it's interesting data. Some might say it doesn't make sense. It actually makes great sense. I would tell you, if we did this in 2015 when we had all that rain, I'll bet it'd be 15, 20 bushel response. What about 2018? What did I say 2018 was like? 2018 was one of the best mineralization years ever. Not only did it not matter when you placed your nitrogen or where you placed it, the quantity you could have used would have been much, much lower. So it didn't matter when or where in 2018. I would contend here this year, had we done this study, we'd probably see a 10 bushel bump. So that's why split applying and delaying your nitrogen applications and placing it closer to the plant, we think will pay. What about fungicide timing on corn? Fungicide timing on corn. So our data would say that brown silk application pays. But one thing I want to point out about this data, actually there's two different things. Number one, if you look at that V5 and VT application, one of the things we did there was we used a name brand fungicide. And when you look at the return, it's there, it's not that great. But if you use today's crop price, this is $3.50 corn. But if you used a generic Strobe and maybe today's crop prices, that V5 and VT return would be higher. However, the VT would still be higher. But the one thing we wanted to think about was, if we delay that decision, are we penalized? So I would tell you, for a lot of folks, southern rust, if you go south of I-80, southern rust is the disease of the day, right? We are dealing with southern rust, and it comes in late in the year. Can we delay our fungicide application and not be penalized? Interestingly enough, our data would say, yeah, you may not be penalized by pushing that fungicide application later into the season. So the question is, why? Because we've accumulated information. We've pushed that decision point longer into the growing season. All right, now the next thing to talk about then is there a better time of day to apply my fungicides? Our data would say there is. If you can apply your fungicides in the morning when it's less than 68 degrees, we see a positive response. I went and looked at data last year in the South where we had heavier disease pressure. Interestingly enough, by spraying that fungicide in the morning when disease pressure was heavier, the response went even higher. Why? Well, I think there's two reasons. First reason I'm going to talk about is actually the plant itself. I'll use a soybean plant because I can grab it right here. But if you think about this, most fungicides, there's some of the newer ones, azoxystrobin and some of the other ones, they translocate. But for the most part, the vast majority of fungicides that we spray today, when we spray them on the leaf, it's called translaminar. They go from the top of the leaf to the bottom of the leaf. That's the movement in the plant. Well, if I spray in the morning when there's a dew on the leaf, I'm spraying that fungicide and it spreads out over that dew, and then it translocates and covers more of the leaf. So one of our former agronomists, Sean Nettleton, he actually did his master's thesis on this, and he went and he swabbed all the water off soybean trifoliates, and then he measured how much water that represented, a heavy dew, how much water a heavy dew represented on a soybean plant for his master's thesis. Anybody want to guess how many gallons per acre a heavy dew is on a soybean plant? It's 162 gallons per acre. What kind of coverage would you get if you sprayed 162 gallons per acre? Probably pretty good. Well, that's the concept. If you have a translaminar product that only travels from the top of the leaf to the bottom of the leaf, doesn't it make sense that the better I can cover that leaf by spraying on a dew would benefit me? That's one of the reasons we think it's important. The other reason has to do with the droplet itself. So think about it. When we spray our herbicides, what do we want to do? We want to spray big herbicides that get down fast. Big droplets that get down fast. What do we want to do with fungicides? We want smaller droplets that float around in that atmosphere, can get down into that canopy, get to as much of the leaf area as we can have it get to. So 100 micron droplet is a medium small droplet. This is from dropdata.org. It's really interesting. If you look at 61 degrees and 58% humidity, that droplet survived 28 seconds. Now, when they crank up the temperature a little bit, but keep the humidity relatively the same, the life of that droplet survived about 18 seconds. But now look what's that tell us? That tells us that the warmer the temperature, the lower the life of that droplet. Remember, we want that droplet to float around and get into the canopy and survive on that leaf as long as possible. But now look what happens when we crank the temperature up even more, but then we crank the humidity way up. What happens then? That droplet life survived 83 seconds on the leaf surface in that canopy moving around. That's a beautiful thing, and that's what we're shooting for, is longer droplet life. Well, why does that matter? Well, let me ask you a question. When are your temperatures coolest and your humidity highest? When do frosts and dews form? In the morning? You know why? Because your temperatures are lowest and your humidities are highest in the morning. And that's why we think spraying when you have lower temperatures and high humidity helps that droplet survive, gets better coverage on the leaf of the dew, makes an impact. All right, switching over to soybeans now. I'm going to talk about a few. So there's a U.S. soybean yield benchmarking project. So 12 Midwest universities a few years back went to about, I think it was 457 fields and traced them for 4 years. And when you see the map, the color areas, what they did is they said these areas of the United States tend to have similar soil types, environmental conditions, and so they grouped them into what they called TEDs, Technology Extrapolation Districts. So every place you see a color, that was a similar TED. Then what they did is they went into those 27 TEDs and they looked at the high-yielding fields in orange and the low-yielding fields in red, and they said, what do these fields have in common? What do these fields have in common? So I'm going to take you for a tour through the Midwest of what they found. This is a metadata analysis. A lot of data here. So if you look up at the top, I just copy and pasted these. They listed out in most TEDs what are the two factors in the state of Illinois that contributed to high yields. What do they have in common? They had in common in Illinois early planting and a foliar fungicide. What about Indiana? In Indiana, the two things that most TEDs that yielded the best had in common was early planting date and foliar fungicide. What about Iowa? Iowa's different, right? Guess what were the high-yielding fields had most in common in Iowa? Early planting date and foliar fungicide. Well, Michigan's really different, right, Sam? Michigan is different, except the things that were most in common in high-yielding fields in Michigan were early planting date and a foliar fungicide. Ohio's definitely different. I spent my first 9 years in Ohio. Ohio's different. Early planting, foliar fungicide. How about Wisconsin? Definitely different in Wisconsin. Early planting, foliar fungicide. You see a trend here. We think early planting and foliar fungicide pay. Well, what does practical farm research say? Well, here's what our data would say. This may come as a shock to you, but foliar fungicide is probably one of the most profitable things you can do. Now, that R3 timing, we would say, is key. Now, I'll point this out as well. If you use today's crop prices, that R2 and R4 application would be profitable. However, that R3 application would still be the most profitable. Well, why is that R3 application so important? Dr. Fred Below at University of Illinois, research would tell us that nodes 6 through 12 on a soybean plant contribute about 65 to 70% of a plant's yield, all right? And here's what we know. We know this trifoliate right here provides the nutrients for these pods. We know this trifoliate provides the nutrients for these pods, so on and so forth. And here's the answer. So, an R3 soybean plant is when at one of the 4 uppermost fully developed nodes, you have a 3/16 inch soybean pod. When I have an R3 plant, which is a 3/16 inch pod, this is, by the way, about R5, but when I have a 3/16 inch pod at one of the 4 uppermost nodes, guess what trifoliate nodes are visible on the plant? Nodes 6 through 12. Or 6 through 13. In other words, that R3 timing, you're spraying the leaflets that cover and provide yield for about 65 to 70% of that soybean plant's yield. And that's why we think that's a critical time for that plant. So flashing back to the U.S. Soybean Benchmarking Project, this is their data to say, how are we doing? Well, when you look at their data, they would say very few people are utilizing that R3 fungicide application. And I would tell you, I get this question a lot. We all do. If you could pick one thing out of PFR, one putting on your sock or tying your shoe, what would it be? It'd be an R3 fungicide application in soybeans. The other one would be planting date, like that U.S. benchmarking project would show. If you look at our data, this is 10-year data. When you look at our data, it would say 16%. If I told you could improve your yield 16%, and all you had to do was plant earlier, would that matter? It does matter. 16% more yield by planting earlier. Now, here's what I want you to understand. This doesn't come without management considerations. You have to think about your planter setup. You have to think about the varieties you choose. You have to think about the seed treatments you use. But early planting pays. Remember that soybean benchmarking project. In fact, if you look at our data, every one of those bars represents a different population. Every single population planted early beat any population planted late. Every single population planted early beat any population planted late. We've had people tell us they went out and bought another planter because of that number in the big yellow circle there, and they don't regret the decision. Early planting pays. So then we went and looked at our data, and we took 15 years of Indiana data, and we started parsing it out. And we said, how many times in that 15 years was a particular planting date the lowest yielding? So that would be the gray bars. And how many times was it the highest yielding? So you would have 15 gray and 15 green. Because every planting date would be, you'd have one highest and one lowest in any one given year. How many times was the late planting date the highest yielding planting date in soybeans? 0. When you do this for corn, actually 2 of the years, you can see that corn, you can have the highest yielding year in late planting in corn. In soybeans, our data would say that's not the case. In fact, if you look at the green bars, that's called a trend line. That is a strong trend line for planting early. Well, then the question is why? Why does it matter so much? Well, as farmers, what are you in the business to do? What do you do as farmers? You harvest sunlight and water. That's what you do. May is the 3rd highest month for daylight in the Midwest. Why do we pass that up as it relates to soybeans? That's what you are in the business to do. So why do we let that slide when that's our 3rd highest month for day length in the Midwest? Well, we wanted to see if we could measure how that might impact our results. So if you think about what are the 4 yield factors in soybeans? 4 yield factors in soybeans: nodes per plant, pods per node, beans per pod, size of the bean. Foundationally, it's nodes per plant. Our data says you gain 4 nodes by planting early. 4 full nodes. All right, well, what do the universities say? Purdue University would say you gain 4 full nodes. If you go to coolbean.org, they will tell you 4 full nodes for planting early. And that's foundationally the largest impact on soybean yield. But I want to talk about something else as it relates to beans, and that's nitrogen. So when we plant early, what happens to our canopy closure? It forms earlier in the year. Well, does that matter as it relates to nitrogen? McGill University did some work and found that soybean nodules basically function best in the low to mid 70 temperatures. So we went out in conventional till systems and went to our early planting dates and our late planting dates and started measuring soil temperatures. And what we found was our soils were 7 to 14 degrees cooler when we planted early because we got earlier canopy closure. Well, does that matter? Is that important? We know that nodules perform best in lower, cooler temperatures, and we know it takes 4 to 5 pounds of nitrogen for every bushel of beans you raise, more so than corn. Okay, Sean Conley, University of Wisconsin, coolbean.org, one of the interesting points he makes is that it's not the number of nodules on this plant that drives soybean yield. It's the efficiency of those nodules. In fact, he would tell you it takes about 8 to 20 highly efficient functioning nodules to support a soybean plant. And I can tell you, we have done dozens and dozens of studies where we count the nodules, and we found really a very poor correlation between the number of nodules and yield. So we know this plant forms about 80% of its nodules at planting depth. All right, 80% of the nodules at planting depth. And if the efficiency of those nodules is important, your planting depth and your row closure and your soil temperature can have a big impact on yield. At least we thought that, so we wanted to do a little more research. So let me ask you a question. When your corn plant, when that grain on your corn plant matures, when it reaches physiological maturity, black layer, what color is your corn plant? It's green. It's still green. When you think about your soybean plant, what color is your soybean plant when this soybean plant reaches physiological maturity, when the bean reaches physiological maturity? It's brown. Why? Because as that plant starts filling these pods, it starts remobilizing nutrients from the leaf and the petiole and putting them into those pods. In other words, this is the factory with a great big warehouse. This is the warehouse. These are the warehouses. If I have a bigger warehouse where I can store more nitrogen to put into the plant, does that matter? Well, what we did, we went and pulled plants April 20th planting, and then we had various planting dates, and then we pulled all these plants and laid them out on June 21st, summer solstice. So what do you think? Is that a bigger factory and a bigger warehouse on the left? It is. And we think that's really important. But here's the other point. Does all that stuff I just told you about nitrogen matter? So what we did is we went and you look at the gray dots. That's yield by planting date. And then we measured multi-location, multi-years. We measured nitrogen content. So does nitrogen content correlate to planting date and yield? That's the green dots. That's a really strong correlation. It's really interesting information. So that's one of the reasons why we think, when we think about closing those rows, cooler soils, planting depth, better nodulation efficiency, that's one of the reasons why early planting pays. So how are we doing? This is that U.S. soybean benchmarking project. If you see a yellow or orange color, that means you're planting the 3rd week of May. Our data would say you're giving up a lot of yield by waiting to plant your soybeans the 3rd week of May, probably for some of the reasons we talked about. All right, seed treatments. I just talked about nitrogen a lot. So seed treatments, let's talk about inoculants. So I started 37 years ago in this business, which I tell everybody, you know what that means, right? I have 1 year of experience 37 different times. That's agriculture, right? But seed inoculants 37 years ago are very different than they are today. The level of bacterium that exists and the survivability are much, much higher. Here's the point I'll make as it relates to seed inoculants. So I've got farm ground in southwest Indiana, poorly drained, crappy clay. We would inoculate every year. If you have a coarse textured soil that gets very hot, poorly drained soil, things that stress those nodules, I would inoculate every year. Here's our data on seed treatments. This is 10-year data. But here's the thing I want you to think about as it relates to seed treatments. They're not about fungicide and insecticide anymore. They're not. There's so much more. If you grow soybeans, this is the map that showed, if you see red, that means there's cyst nematode in that county. All right, if you grow soybeans in the county, there's cyst nematode in that county. I'm not saying it's threshold, and I'm not saying it's in your field necessarily. But if you grow soybeans in that county, they're there. Seed treatments will be the delivery mechanism for all kinds of things in the future, including nematicide control, biologicals. Think about this. Bayer, Syngenta, Corteva have all spent billions of dollars to purchase biological companies. Why? Because there's stuff to be learned there. Now, here's what I say. If this is everything there is to know about biologicals right now, this is about how much we know. But we're going to get better at it. And your seed treatments will be the delivery mechanism for those compounds later on. How are we doing cyst nematode-wise? So there's the county that have the highest cyst nematode pressure. We're actually doing pretty good on seed treatments, though. That's encouraging. All right, row width. 2 more. Now, row width is a little more complicated and a little more challenging, and it's not as easy as you might think. But if you look at our 15-inch versus 30 data, every one of those bars represents a different population. Our data would say every population planted in 15s beat any population planted in 30s. So we wanted to ground truth that a little bit, and we went and looked at what the university said. So Pally Peterson at Iowa State University, if you look at his data, he got 20-year Midwest data would say it's about 4.5 bushel in Iowa, black prairie soil, to move from 30s to 15s. Fred Below, that last line there, University of Illinois would say it's about 2.1 bushel. Purdue University would say it's about 7%, so about 3.5 or 4 bushel. Well, why? Oh, could be that weed control is a part of that equation. When you look at weed pressure, this is Kevin Bradley, University of Missouri, that measured pigweed populations by row width. What's the best herbicide available today? I'll give you a hint. It's free, and it's called shade. Shade is the most effective herbicide. The best weed to control is one that never emerges, and shading is the best way to keep weeds from emerging. So here's practical farm research data. We show it's about a 50% reduction when you go from 30s to 15s. This is data from Purdue University. How could I get that wrong? I went there. Purdue University. And basically they looked at 3 different row widths, and they removed weeds at different times relative to the row width. And you can see the yield penalty in the wide rows is the highest, and then narrows, and then narrower. So I'm going to show you a video here from the University of Nebraska, and they're talking the same concept. What's the penalty for wide rows as it relates to weeds?
There's money attached to all of this, so could you tell us a little bit about yield loss when you delay weed management?
Right, there is money tied on the end. Basically, based on our research, we come up with the general rule of thumb, what I called. It's a 2% yield loss in corn and 2.5% yield loss in soybeans for every crop's leaf stage of delayed weed control. For example, if I tell you to go in at the V1 stage in soybeans, if you go in at V2, that's going to cost you 2.5%. If you raise 60 bushel beans, 2.5% of 60 bushel is a 1.5 bushel. So money-wise, that would run you easily $10.
So $10 per acre at the old pricing structure, not today. So row width certainly matters as it relates to weed pressure and yield. So the question I get a lot is, then why don't we move to 7.5s? Well, it has to do with the tent next door where they have all those planter units, right? The beauty of a planter unit is 3 things. It can control the overall population, it can control the uniformity of depth, and it can control the plant-to-plant spacing so much better. I would contend that our biggest advances in our high-yield soybean plot probably have come from not the fertility and not the things we're doing there, but our ability to singulate soybeans. We're getting 99.5% singulation now with our soybeans. So we wanted to test that out. So we went and built a planter that could plant 10, 20, or 30-inch rows, vary the population, and vary the variety or hybrid on the go. Because if this is true, if by using a row unit in narrow rows, if everything I've told you is true, then we should see some pretty dramatic yield increases moving to narrower rows. And sure enough, when you look at our data, it would say narrowing the rows with the row unit makes a big difference. I pulled some conclusions from a Purdue study that I mentioned earlier. They said 3 things in their study: narrower rows work, early planting pays, and seeding rates matter too. And that's the last thing I want to talk to you about is seeding rates. Now, we're a seed company, and our job is to sell you seed that works and helps you succeed on your farm. But why in the world am I up here telling you to plant less soybean seed? Because our data would say that that's the best way to maximize your ROI. And that's our job, is to help you maximize it. But one thing I want you to think about when we think about seeding rates, by the way, we are not advocating for you to use 100,000 seeding rate. What we are saying is if you're at 180,000, try 170 or 160, try that. If you're at 160, try 150. But one thing I want you to think about, the ROI does not necessarily come from yield. In fact, if you look, the yields are fairly flat, maybe even a little higher at the higher seeding rates. The ROI comes from the cost of the seed. About every 10,000 seeds is $5 in your pocket. So here's what I'm telling you to do. Plant less soybean seed, take that money, go invest in a fungicide, spray it at R3. You'll improve your ROI dramatically. A little less soybean seed, a little more fungicide, plant it a little early, you'll improve your ROIs dramatically. Now, one thing to think about, I talked about weed density and row width. How about weed density of population? Yeah, it matters. If you have less less plants, you have more sunlight. I talked about shade being critical. Yeah, you're going to increase your weed pressure, lower population. So it's a consideration to think about. How are we doing on seeding rates at U.S. Soybean Yield Benchmarking Project? We're doing pretty good, actually. Overall, I think we're doing pretty good. Okay, Tim Rao, where are you at? Left or right? Oh, you're left. Left. All right, give me a number 1 to 18. 7? Give me a number 1 to 15. 5. Right? You said left, which is my right. What'd you say, 7? And what'd you say, 7? Excuse me real quick. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4. You're closest to it. I talked about putting $100 in your pocket. It's real. All right. All right. So, when I talk, and actually I'm not going to ask that back from you at the end of the show either. You can have that. Look, it's that easy. Putting $100 in your pocket. Think about what we talked about early on. Putting on your socks and tying your shoes. Focusing on the basics. Do a couple of those things and you can improve the return in your farm $100 pretty easily. With that, I just want to say thank you very much for coming here and joining us today. We're honored that you chose to spend your day with us. You had a lot of options, a lot of things you could have done today. So we thank you very much for coming. Wish you safe travels home. Have a great day, everybody.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our 58th annual field show. How many of you who have been here all 58 years, or how many were here at least the very first one? Problem is my wife is not in the crowd. She's about the only one that remembers 1964. We're the first one. Here's what the picture looks like. My wife and I had just come back from college and in 1964, and so we were going to advertise this new thing called single cross corn. Now, that was an improvement over regular hybrid seed corn, which my father and grandfather had started in 1937. So this single cross corn was going to do 10 to 15 bushels more than what they were already doing. Well, in today's world, 10 to 15 bushels more on top of a 200 bushel yield or 175 is a big deal, but it was a really big deal in 1964 because what was the average yield? What was the average yield of American farmers in 1964? 75. You're pretty close. Absolutely, yes. It was somewhere between 64, 67, 68. I like to call it 64 because I can remember it easy. So 60. The red dots here, the red dots on this chart would be the yield of every year. This is a kind of a guideline here of about where the average of all that is, but the red dots give the actual thing. So we're looking at 1964 about right there. So what was the yield in 1937? Well, I give you a hint, it's about the same as a year. It was about 37 bushels per acre. So that was a single cross was a big deal. I mean, regular hybrid seed corn was a big deal, 1937. It gave us at least a bushel per acre increase per year, but this single cross corn was going to give us a couple bushels per acre increase. Let me go back to 1901 then, when my father and actually my grandfather had settled on this farm. Right across the road here, 80 acres. My grandfather was the seventh of about 8 children, and when each child got married, they got 80 acres off of the original couple sections of land that my great-grandfather and his son had settled in 1836 through 1838, about 6 miles north of here. And so there was only 40 acres left for my grandfather. And so he didn't think he could make a living on that 40 acres, all cleared off and ready to go, but he sold that 40 and moved down here to this 80 acres right across the road and bought that. And he decided to finish clearing that off and so forth. So 1901 to 1937, what was the average yield and the average yield increase? It was very little, because if you look at this chart that I showed you earlier, you'll see that 1900 is pretty level, isn't it? There was very little progress made, even though my grandfather saved out the best half a bushel of corn every day that he shucked 100 bushel by hand and saved those biggest ears from the best stalks. But it never amounted to very much increase because the genes were they're all over the place, just open pollinated. They needed to be solidified into some in a female and some in a male. That's what hybridization was about in 1937. So, as we move to one step further, my grandfather then, by 1920, that's a picture of Lawrence there, standing on the white house porch over here that you can see. And he'd built the house, he'd built the barn. They had cows, chickens, pigs, and everything like that. He'd bought another 40 acres over here. And so he was starting to move along and progress and build the farm. In 1937 is when he and my father took their 3-acre allotment that Purdue University said any farmer can come and get. They each got 3 acres. Therefore, they started the seed company, the Hybrid Seed Corn Company, in 1937. This picture, my father is in the white, my grandfather is in the black, and this picture is of the first drying plant that they built. This was a state-of-the-art drying plant for those days, and it still stands in the middle of our complex. However, it's used as a break room for our employees at the present time. But the thing I remember about that white building there, that drying plant, was that's where my father spent 6 weeks in the fall sleeping, because somebody had to stoke the furnace with the coal. You had to have a furnace. It had to keep the temperature just right, can't get too hot. And so every 2 hours he would get up and stoke the furnace. So things were a little tougher. Maybe we think it'd have tough today. And then he got up and picked corn the next day. So let me fast forward about 25 years now to 1964 and 65. You saw the slide earlier of the first field day. But this is what the farm looked like when Glenda and I came back to the farm. You can see here, that's the white house that my grandfather was standing on, and here's the original building here, the drying plant, and so forth. So, what else happened in 1964-65? We came back to the farm, but before we came back, my professors at Purdue, and one in particular said, you know, Sonny, said this consolidation thing is, it's going to hit you someday. He says, all businesses, consolidate. He says, it's going to be a problem. And so what are you going to do about it? At that point in time, I said, well, I'm going to go back to the farm. We just want to go back and farm, and we're going to take a chance on it. We're going to take a chance that we can be one of the companies that might make it. And so this is 64, 65. And so we decided to do that. However, things went pretty good until 1968 when we needed a new planter. We needed a narrow row planter. We needed an 8-row planter so we could plant this short single cross corn. And we also needed a tractor. We did not have a tractor to pull it. And so I showed my parents the ROI, remember that, return on investment, that if we bought this planter and we bought this tractor, we could pay for it in a couple years. But their response was, we don't have the money. We don't have that much money. They said, I said, well, we could go to the bank and borrow it because I can pay it back. And they said, which I already knew the answer, but they said no. Remember, we lived through the Depression. And we saw many farmers lose part or all their farms when they borrowed money and then couldn't repay it. So we will operate the farm. When you have the money, you can spend the money. When you make more money, you can spend more money. Well, I thought, okay, that's what we'll do. Any of you parents lived in the Depression that know that system? Yes, that was very much the mindset at that point in time. And so we lived by that model until for 35 years, well into the 90s. You never borrowed a penny, you always made the money, and then you got to spend it. Well, it allowed for very slow growth, about 10% per year, but it also allowed for a very, very steady growth. That's the basis of our family today. It's the basis of why we're still family owned and not had to go outside and get other money and draw investors in, like from Wall Street or wherever, and then pay them out money. So we just grow as we can. So what did I do for a planter? We didn't have the money to buy a tractor. We didn't have the money to buy a planter. So you see here in this picture, if you look, some of you may remember the uni system, the new idea uni system, where there was a corn picker on the front of this. All we had to do is take the corn picker off, or the snouts right here, build this framework here, get an old $15 oil barrel. That was our fertilizer. And by golly, we had a tractor and we had a planter. We bought a few units here, built all the rest of the system. And we had a tractor and a planter for very low money. And that allowed us to save enough money that by the next year we could start in on building another dryer, because by 1968 we needed another dryer by 1969. So we was able to start on that. So a very solid but stable growth is what I learned from that. We operated that way around 1990. And then what happened in 1990 was, this consolidation thing was becoming real. I talked with my professors, some of them up at Purdue, and they said, are you ready for that? And I said, well, I don't know. They said, well, you need to do a paper on it. You need to study on it and see what you think is going to happen in your industry. I said, when you finish that, write a paper. Why, you can come back and you'll present it to the rest of our agriculture economics department up here. And I said, jokingly, I said, Professor, I wrote papers for you back in 1964, but I graduated, I got my degree. Why do I have to do more work for you? He said, it's not work for you. He says, it's work for you. And so it did cause us to study. And what we found out, what we predicted was that of our 300 seed companies that we have at that time, 100 would sell within 10 years, 100 would merge with somebody else, not have your own name, but you'd still have a job, and only about 100 might be left by the year 2000. So then, what are we going to do? Son Scott had come back in 1987. Some other key employees had started to come back and with us in those around 1990. Eric Hassler lives in the house right over here that my parents built. Tom Hooper's our director of sales. Tim Wisman and some others came about that time. So we had 19 employees. And so we said, you have to have a mission more than what you sell. You have to have a mission more than what you sell. I used the example of the guy that invented the Polaroid camera. Great idea. It had a peak and it came down. He was only concerned about making it a little bit better and a little bit cheaper. He did not realize what he was doing. What he was doing was taking an image that could be reproduced later, and you needed to produce it in huge quantities. What's that smartphone that you got in your pocket right now? He should have invested in that. Something that could give a digital copy instead of just a paper copy. So find out what you do. Well, what do we do? Well, we like to do our practical farm research. After all, we started as that first study in 1964, and we've been adding 2 or 3 studies every year, ones that our customers ask for, ones that we think of. Guys, we had 50, 60 studies by 1990. That's what we love to do. We love to farm. We are first farmers at heart. And we like to help other farmers succeed. That's the reason we were doing the practical farm research and giving free replant out to our customers. And so kind of like our mission or our real purpose in life is to help farmers succeed. It sounds corny, but I'm telling you, it's exactly what we base our decisions on today. So helping farmers succeed. We said we will double down on practical farm research. There's some things that we would like to be doing that we aren't currently doing. We know that no-till was coming in 1990 here. And no-till versus conventional, what's the long-term effect? Okay, let's start some long-term studies on no-till. And so we did that, and today you can see on one of the tours this no-till versus conventional study. This is conventional over here, and this is no-till right here. If I show you a close-up of that area, you'll see the extra residue that we've accumulated, and we actually are building some yield over that 30 years. What gave us the idea on this was the fact that the University of Illinois has the Morel plots. The Morel plots are plots that they started on continuous corn 100 years ago, around the turn of the century. So they have those plots, continuous corn, year after year after year. It's in the middle of campus. There's still a plot left there that continues to show what the effects are of corn after corn. We intend to have a really long study here on the effects of conventional versus conventional, conventional versus no-till. One of the other things I had a personal interest in was that as I worked my ground on the angle and then planted straight, every time you crossed the rubber tired tracks from the tractor, what do you get? You got a little less yield, sometimes a little yellow if it happened to rain a little too much, and so forth. There must be an effect of that compaction of those tires. So let's start some long-term studies. So this is a current version of a track tractor. In those days, we just used what would have been a dirt-moving Caterpillar tractor, but it was tracks, and we packed every inch of, let's say, a strip about 80 foot wide, like this. Just drove the Caterpillar tractor over it every inch. Then on the next 80-foot strip, we used our rubber tire, 4840 tractor, and we drove that every inch packed by that rubber tire. And then we had an international tractor we used to do the next strip, and then we had a smaller tractor. So we had all these different rubber-tired tractors. The track type over here gave us 6 pounds per square inch. None of the rest, they were all 12 pounds per square inch of pressure, up to 18 pounds of pressure. So it showed us that fact that compaction can be a problem. So one of our biggest successes is when the industry and other people take ideas that we might prove and take them to the industry. We're not in the business of building tractors or anything that we do test. We're in the business of helping farmers succeed with great new ideas. So look at how many tracks are on the farm now. Lots of them. And so it's those kinds of studies that we like getting involved with. 1992, the one last study that we doubled down on and because of how we're going to succeed was that we knew that Roundup Ready was coming along, those type of things. Also coming along with other traits on soybeans, and soybeans would become as expensive to plant per acre as a corn seed. So in the old days, go get another scoop of non-treated beans and throw them out there. It didn't matter. They weren't worth much. But now, with the traits on them, they're going to be more charges. So we did long-term studies starting in 1992. Those studies are also now 30 years old. And what we have found is that soybeans respond to the treatments that we're putting on far more than does corn. If you only have so much treatment, you better put on your soybeans instead of your corn. So the Escalate treatment that we have in today's world has several insecticides, 2 to 3. It has some fungicides, 3 or 4 fungicides, so that whatever bug, whatever fungus is available that year or because of the weather, we've got one on there to help this soybean seed germinate. And then we put biologicals on there that actually help it to grow faster. What's a biological? A biological, okay, anybody ever farmed a fence row, took out a fence row, and then you farm it the first year? The corn's always a foot taller, isn't it? Yeah. How come we as farmers ruin it? After 3 years, I can't even see where I took that fence row out. It's because of the biological activity that is that fence row living through the winter, roots living through the winter, that these biologicals, some good fungus, there's also good bacteria, they live there, and therefore they're available quicker. So if we can harvest those, we do in today's world, and we put small amounts on that seed there, then that gives that first plant a head start on getting the biological activity started. So some people say, well, how come you don't sell non-treated beans? I said, because we found out that treated beans are so much better. You can reduce your seeding rate, and you can have more uniform stands. It's a little bit like when I was growing up, my mom said, eat your green beans. And I said, I don't know, I don't like green beans very well. She says, eat your green beans, they're good for you. So we're a little bit like that on treatment. We're saying, hey, Mama knows best. We've done a lot of studies, and we just feel like that it's the best thing to have the treatment on there to help that young plant get going faster. And it amounts to bushels per acre also. So another thing with a little gray hair, I've kind of stepped back from the seed business for a minute, and I've watched other people too, and that I respect. And I've seen that a lot of people, if they help others in life, it will probably turn out okay for you. And if it doesn't, you still did the right thing. In other words, if you go through life remembering to always help others, it'll probably turn out okay for you. But if it doesn't, it really doesn't matter because you did the right thing. Now back to the seed business. Okay. So we're going to now go from 1990 to about 10 years later, 98 to 2000. The seed business is growing a bit and a little bit at a time in circles, and now we've come to most of Indiana and just a little bit on the outside of Indiana. And there are 75 employees at that point in time. Here's a picture of them. In 2001, you see the 3 towers. This was a corn tower built for corn only, a soybean tower for soybean only, and then this tower built in 1998 did corn, soybeans, and wheat. All 3 of those do about 2.8 million bushels last year. So remember that number. It could be important later. Current employees, this was 75, 2000, 2001. We're now at 2021, and current employees would be right at 809 to be exact. So current employees are about 10 times what they were back then. Sites that we're selling in, this is up to date now, site that we're selling in right now would be, and we're selling in 14 states right here, all green. And these are the sites around. They either would be process production, processing, distribution, or research, or a distribution-only plant. The gray areas here and here, These are areas that we're looking over the fence at and saying, that's Nebraska, this is the rest of Kansas, we're already in part of Kansas. We have products that will go into those areas, been testing for years. So why aren't we there? We need to wait until we can effectively transfer what we're doing in this last county here before we move there. In other words, we have to effectively be able to transfer what we're doing and not move out too fast beyond what we can handle sufficiently and take care of farmers the same way we do inside. It also means that we have to have people that believe in our concept. They believe that we're not just selling a farmer a bag of corn and leaving. They're helping that farmer succeed. They're giving them tips on practical farm research. They're giving them tips on how you don't have to replant, but we'll furnish replant if you have to. They're giving them tips on other parts of their farming just to help them succeed. So that's a certain type of person that probably only 20% of the people that we interview would have that mindset of wanting to help others, wanting to help their farmers. And so because we do have several thousand people actually apply for a job every year, we are able to select and wait until we can select those right people that we feel have a mindset of helping farmers succeed. So let's move to the actual sales numbers here. And this is by acres. That starts back here in 1964. You see, you can hardly see it on the map, 72. This is 10 to 11, 12% growth all through here. You say, that can't be right, Sonny. This, if you say this is 10% to 2000, this has to be more. No, it's still 10%, but the number that it's on just keeps growing and growing. So if you look at what the sales were this year, okay, red, it's not bags, that is acres. Green is acres of beans, red's acres of corn. A little bit of wheat down here. So this past year in the ground right now, 2021 over 2020, our sales grew by 8% on corn and 9% on beans. That wasn't even 10 or 12%, was it? But what's startling to me is this number right here. In 2021, this year, there are almost 1 million more acres planted to Beck seed than a year ago. That's what becomes kind of daunting for me, is like a whole 1 million acres more in 1 year. And so, yeah. So how do we have to take care of that? How many units will we have to have? If I'm going to talk about 1 million acres and half of it's corn, half of it's beans, if 500,000 acres of beans, how many bags of seed does that take? How many units? About 1 bag for every acre, right? So about 500,000 units of beans every year. It's 500,000. This right here, it's about 500,000 acres, but it's only, divide that by 2.2, 2.3, it's only about 200,000 units of corn new every year. So 500,000 of beans, 200,000 units of corn, that's what the projected growth is, even at only 8-9%. So that's the reason we have to think about doing things like a new tower. I'm going to give you a picture of the plant 2 years ago, before we built the tower. Here you see those 3 plants, corn, beans, and wheat. And over here's the house, of course, that I talked about growing up in. And here is the plot where we need to build a new 3 million unit capacity soybean plant. 3 million, and we can do it magically right now. So this new plant at 3 million units per year is effectively the same size as all 3 of these plants back here. So this will help us for how many years? How many of you got good head math there to see? If we needed 500,000 every year, well, and this is 3 million, that's going to hold us for maybe 6 years. I mean, it's not forever. It's going to hold us for about 6 years. But what also happens here is that we have other states that we sell in, 14 other states. And so we will be buying plants in other states. Here's one that we just bought. This was a Bayer soybean plant just north of Des Moines, about an hour and a half, at what's called Beeman, Iowa, right in the center of where we needed a plant. We had designed to, build one there in a couple of years. And here we are able to purchase this plant, a very nice plant. And so we knew about it in March. We could only announce it here when everything closed up about a week ago. And so we'll be taking soybeans in there this fall, and we'll be shipping soybeans out of there next spring. That plant can do a little over a million units. So what makes all this possible would be going back to the family attitude that I started off with about the Depression, all those types of things. The family believes in putting their money back into the company the same way that many of you do. You take your money, maybe buy another farm, buy another tractor, but you invest it inside the company. And that's what allows us to remain family-owned. It allows us to not have to go outside the company and take money from the public companies that we'd have to pay back shareholder profits to them. If you look at those public records, you'll see that most of those people pay out 10% or more of their profit, the first thing, out to shareholders. We can take that, hopefully we have the same profit, right? We try to have a profit. Any of you not for profit? I don't think so. Okay, not on purpose at least, not on purpose. So, I'm hearing a lot of rumblings back there. So, we can take those shareholder profits. I mean, it's very simple. About 12 years ago, we had this concept, and we tried it, and we don't want to get rid of it. It's a way we share back with our customers. So customers that say, I'm going to be a customer, here I'm signing the form, I'm going to buy seeds from you, so much seed, we can reward them with commitment reward items that you see all through, tools, tractors, and toys. So that's how we can fund it. It's not that we don't spend as much on our research. It's not that we don't have the best hybrids. We just don't have to pay shareholders. So that kind of wraps up the story. And when I'm talking back about family, I want to bring up Corey Beck, who's now 5th generation Becks. And he's going to talk about our supplier relations. And I appreciate if you give him a hand on the way up.
Well, good morning. I'm Corey Beck, and I get to serve as the licensing lead for our business, and want to spend some time with you this morning talking about my role, and particularly how that relates to the emphasis that we as a company place on our strategic relationships with our trait and genetic suppliers. And so I want to highlight each of those relationships. And then I want to just spend some time telling some stories. And so as I reflected on this talk and what I wanted to share, I thought about the times growing up around here where I would be doing different activities. Maybe it's riding the four-wheeler around our Atlanta facilities here, or it's pulling weeds in the organic plot, or it's taking stand counts. And so I really had the privilege of being able to be here and experience a lot of the people that have really helped to shape this business and shape our company. And consequently, those same people have helped to shape who I am. And so my goal would be just to share a few of those stories with you this morning. But first, I'd like to give you kind of a Facebook relationship status update with each of these partners that you see on the screen here. And so it was several years ago that we identified that one of the hallmarks of our business, or a strategic capability, is this idea of diverse product access. And so today, we can make the statement that we've got the most diverse product lineup of any company in the world. And so, quite simply, my job is to make sure that that same statement is as true tomorrow as it is today. And so, as I'm engaged in facilitating the conversations or the discussions and negotiations and agreements between our leadership team here at Beck's and the leadership at the organizations that you see on the screen, it's really about keeping that same mindset and making sure that we've got the right products as a part of our product portfolio, and they show up at the right value proposition for our customers. And so with that, I think I'll highlight each of the companies here that you see on the screen. I'll get started with Bayer. And so Bayer is a company that we continue to believe in and invest in for the future. As I think about this relationship, and I think about particularly from the corn standpoint, we've got very strong, high-performing products that come out of the Bayer camp. And so as you think about Double Pros or Smart Stacks products, those really dot up and down our product lineup regardless of maturity range. And so excited about that opportunity to continue to grow from a corn standpoint. And then from a soybean technology standpoint, the XtendFlex platform was our lead soybean technology in 2021. We expect that to be the case again in 2022. And so we've got a lot of momentum and excitement building in our relationship with Bayer. I'd like to talk about Corteva next. And so this is a relationship that's largely defined by our XL Corn distribution brand. And so as I think about that, really where we're most excited about the XL brand is in our 2022 product launch class. And so nearly half of the new corn products that are in our lineup for 2022 are coming as a result of the XL brand. And so excited about that. Then I need to make mention, the Corteva company was formed just a few years ago through the Dow and DuPont merger. And so Dow being one of the co-developers of the Enlist trait, and we've seen the momentum building there. And so we spent considerable time and effort this winter making sure that we broaden and deepen our Enlist trait platform and the genetic base that supports that. And so excited about building upon the momentum that exists there from a soybean technology standpoint. We do see the industry narrowing towards more of a 2 soybean platform approach. And so it's important, an important part of our business to make sure that we continue to have the genetic diversity and choices that support each of those 2 platforms. I'll move on to Syngenta now. And so as I think about the Syngenta relationship, where we get most enthused is in our corn lineup, and particularly highlighting the lower productivity and medium productivity soils. These are the acres where really the Syngenta traits, the Agrasure, the Viptera, or Duracade, as a few examples, this is where those products really shine and they become ROI leaders for a lot of our customers on those LP and MP acres. And so we've got a lot of momentum building there with the Syngenta relationship. And then I'll mention BASF. And so for a handful of years now, the LLGT27 Freedom Plus Series soybeans have been a big part of our lineup. And so I mentioned just a few seconds ago that we do see a narrowing of the soybean industry. And so as we see that happening, want to make mention, we continue to offer the Freedom Plus Series soybeans for 2022. We believe in the genetic base that supports that platform. But really where we're most excited about the BASF relationship is really on 2 fronts, okay? And so that is the first being from a seed treatment standpoint. And so as we think about our seed treatments, the Escalate seed treatment package that we believe and know to be first in class, the Poncho Votivo, the 2.0, and the Ilevo components, those are all sourced through our relationship with BASF. And then the other thing that we're excited about is future soybean technology developments. And so we know that towards the latter part of the decade, there's a new soybean trait that's going to be coming through the BASF camp. And so it's important for our business to continue to engage with those folks there. Real quickly, I'll do a better job of defining the other box that you see there on the screen. And so this is really representative of our internal breeding efforts. And so I'll dive deeper into that a little bit later on, but want to make mention we continue to invest in our research program and our internal breeding efforts. And so, like I said, I'll dive further into that in a little bit. Before I move on, I do want to make mention, I talked about the BASF developments toward the latter part of the decade, but really the next wave of soybean technology. And so as we think about what that might be, that's going to come out of the Bayer camp, and it's what they call HT4. And so you've got the XtendFlex technology today, and so that gives you the Liberty, the Roundup, and the dicamba tolerance. And so the HT4 soybean is really bolting on additional herbicide tolerance on top of that package from an HPPD standpoint, and then a 2,4-D component. And so we're expecting that HT4 is going to be coming here in the next 5-6 years or so. And so that's really kind of the landscape of our supplier relationships to this point. And so I mentioned earlier that I wanted to tell some stories, and so that's really what I intend to do with the remaining part of my time here this morning. And so there's an awful lot of people and departments here at Beck's where it's pretty clear and apparent how those people show up every day and they do help farmers. For instance, Sonny mentioned our Commitment Rewards program. Well, that's oftentimes a very tangible item. That's the new hopper bottom trailer or it's a 3-year tractor lease. And so then it's also the working capital that gets unlocked on that farm and can be put to use elsewhere. And so it's easy to see how that program is designed and geared to help farmers. But there are other departments and other people that work here in our business that help farmers in ways that maybe aren't so clear. And so I'd like to spend some time highlighting just a few of those areas in our company. And I'm going to get started here with a couple that's worked here in our business for 2 decades, and that's Wade and Rhonda Overdorf. And so Wade and Rhonda have really elevated the experience here of every guest that walks through our Atlanta facilities over the course of the last 19 years. And as I think about Wade and Rhonda and their role and how it impacts the farmer, I really kind of think about 2 things, okay? And so how important is it to our business that every guest that walks through our front doors has a clean, safe, welcoming environment to walk into? They can walk up to the front counter and talk to our staff there and lay out some paperwork, learn about our business, ask questions. I think that's pretty important to our business. Another example would be, how about a customer that's here to pick up seed, and so they're driving through the parking lot, and somebody's dumped a bucket of nails and not cleaned it up. And so all of a sudden that customer's got a flat tire. They're an hour or 2 late getting home. They've missed their daughter's softball game. Their wife is upset with them. And so that's really a poor experience that somebody at Beck's has created. And beyond a poor experience, we've really contributed to not allowing that person to have a successful evening with their family. And so as I think about Wade and Rhonda and our entire facilities department across all of our locations throughout our marketing area, they do a great job of showing up every day and really do have a positive impact on the farmer and on our customers and guests. Next person I'd like to talk about is a friend of mine, Jason Gaheimer. And so Jason and I go back to the time when I was just a teenager. Of course, right now, Jason is leading our practical farm research efforts, which is now over 900 acres across 9 locations throughout the Midwest, doing 125 different studies a year, testing products and practices, trying to figure out which ones contribute to a better bottom line for farmers. And so in addition to that, Jason was one of the pioneers of this idea of our concept of PFR Proven. And that's where we've tested a product or a practice and figured out that, hey, this product has a positive impact on yield and an average positive return on investment 3 years in a row. If that's the case, they get a positive a PFR Proven sticker. And so we've now got over 105 is the exact number of PFR Proven products and practices. And so appreciate all of Jason's efforts as he leads that team. But I do want to share a story about Jason that goes back to the time when I was a teenager and we were working in a sign shop. And so you can see the sign there on the screen, the 4613A3. And so at this point in time, in the summer months, we were getting these signs ready to go for all of these plot tours and making sure that we had all the test plots labeled. And so it was individual numbered stickers. And so we'd have to put the 4 on, and then the 6 and the 1, and make sure they're all straight. And then you got the trait sticker across the top. But in addition to that, we had these yellow rider signs. And so that's the sign there that says 200 pounds. And so those really represented a lot of different test plots that we may have been doing. And the thing about those rider signs is we reuse those every single year. And so that meant that it took considerable effort from myself or some other people to spend the winter months, January and February, sitting amongst stacks and piles of these signs and doing what we call picking and grinning, okay? And so that's where you take a razor blade or whatever, and you're picking these weather-hardened stickers off of these signs for hours on end until your fingers are red and raw. And but what it did was it created an opportunity to connect with one another. And so the same way that Jason invested in me as I was a teenager, I continue to see him invest in the relationships that he has with people on his team and also with the farmers that he interacts with on a daily basis. And so I really appreciate what Jason does to contribute to our team. The next lady I'd like to talk about is Brittany Street. And so if you've traveled with us on a customer trip or a dealer trip, you may recognize Brittany. Brittany does a tremendous job leading our travel and events team. But a fun fact about Brittany is her husband, Mitch, was my high school football coach. And 2 days before we played in the state championship game, my senior year, Brittany gave birth to 2 twin girls, Layla and Landry. And so those girls are going to turn 9 later this fall. And I've got a great relationship with the Street family. They're really good friends of mine. But as it relates to Brittany's role and what she does here leading our travel and events team, you know, we were really disappointed not to be able to travel last year as a result of COVID restrictions. And we're super excited to be able to do that again here this year. But there is a significant difference between the 2 years. And so as we think about any normal year, we expect about 3,000 or so guests to travel with us. This is not a normal year. And because we allowed customers who earned that trip last year to roll it forward into 2021, what you'll find is we're expecting about 6,000 people to travel with us this winter. And so that's a considerable undertaking for Brittany and her staff. And so with that comes a significant deadline then of October the 10th to get information turned in. And that's really largely due to the relationships that we have with our airlines and travel agencies. And so we've been assured and guaranteed that if the information for those wanting to travel with us is turned in and submitted by October the 10th, they're going to have a spot to travel with us. After that deadline, we cannot continue to operate with that same guarantee. And so I would just encourage you, if you're interested and qualify to travel with us this year, we would love to have you and would encourage you just to turn in your information as quickly as possible. So I mentioned that other box on our supplier relationship screen. And so this is where the next gentleman that I'd like to talk about comes into play, and that's Keith Rufner. So Keith is our most senior corn breeder. He's one of 6 corn breeders on our staff here. We've got 3 in Indiana, 2 in Iowa, and 1 in Minnesota. And so I'm going to borrow a phrase from Jim Schwartz, who's our Director of Research and PFR and Agronomy. And so Jim likes to talk about being uniquely different and uniquely better. And so as I think about how that pertains to Keith's role and our other corn breeders, you know, our corn breeders are like every other corn breeding program in the country in that they are 100% designed to go after the best product on the best acre, the best block of soil that exists, okay? Where we differentiate ourselves is that we've got a tailored approach to not forget about those LP and MP acres. And so we've got significant and design testing to make sure that we are breeding and targeting every acre that our farmers are farming on. And so Keith and the corn breeders do a tremendous job differentiating our program from the others that exist. The next guy I'd like to talk about has been a part of our business for 3.5 decades, and that's Tim Wisman. And so Tim has a lot of important roles here at Beck's. One of those is that he's the number 4 employee on our years of service list. So 1986 is the year that Tim started with us, and he leads a lot of different production efforts. And so you think about what Tim does from a staging of the seed stock in the spring, making sure that the right female is ready to go on this acre and the right male is over here, and it's there on time for our production team to get out there and get it planted. I think about summer detasseling crews. So Tim leads those efforts. You think about the significance of that role from a timing standpoint and a purity standpoint, really important job. And then he manages our warehouse space. And so making sure that seed is shown up and it's stored and staged in all the right areas so we can be most efficient in getting it out to our customers. And so that's all what Tim does during the day here as he works for our company. He's also really involved in the community. And so for years, Tim has coached high school softball just down the street here at Hamilton Heights High School, which is where I went to school. And he also kept the stat sheet for Friday night football games. And so me being the starting quarterback for our teams, that really meant that Tim was just tallying up how many interceptions I may have thrown any given Friday night. And that's where I'm going to tell a story. It is not a high school glory days football story. It reflects fairly poorly of my ability as a quarterback, but it 100% depicts who Tim is and what he's brought to our team for 35 years, okay? And so it's September 30th of 2011, and we're playing a road game. My team has started the season 6-0. We're off to a great start. This is a really important conference game. And so we're down by 6 in the 4th quarter. And again, we're on the road. We've got the ball on the 4-yard line, and it's 3rd and goal. Okay? And so as a quarterback, this is absolutely where you want to be. You've got an opportunity to win the game or lose the game on a single play. Okay? And so I'm walking towards the line of scrimmage, and we're down by 6. I'm in the shotgun. I've got a receiver over here to my left. I've got a tight end to my right, another receiver to my right, and a running back behind me in the backfield, and I'm ready to take the snap. The receiver to my left has a quick slant pattern drawn up, okay? And so this guy is just going to take a couple steps forward and cut diagonally across the field, and it's my job as the quarterback to take the snap, take one step, and deliver the pass on time and on target. This particular night, I take the snap, I get right here, and I hesitate for just a second, okay? And this is where I learned a valuable life lesson, and that is that sometimes it's better to be decisive than right, okay? Because I got here, and my indecision, just for a second, gave the defensive back just enough time to jump in front of the pass, interception, game over, we lose 33-27. Okay, and so after the game, I'm kind of walking with my head down across the field. I'm frustrated, disappointed in myself. It's the first loss of the season. And as I'm walking across the field, I look over to my left, and I see Tim sitting there on the bench, and that's where he would be after every game. Of course, he's got his calculator there, and he's tallying up third down conversion percentage, how many passing yards did we have, how many rushing yards, all those statistics. And so he and I made eye contact, and I just kind of kept walking. And about 5 seconds later, I hear, "Hey." So I stop, and I look back over my left shoulder, and he looked at me, and he says, "Keep your head up. There's a lot more games to be won." And so that stuck out to me because he didn't stop at just, "Hey, keep your head up." What he said was, "There's a lot more games to be won." And that's really representative of Tim's attitude and approach here at Beck's over the last 35 years, is that not everything goes according to plan. You will fail. There will be challenges, but you've got an opportunity to show up again and win. And so as I think about what Tim has done for longer than I've been alive, he's shown up to help people, help our community, help our team. And so I really appreciate what Tim does as a part of our business. Next person I'd like to talk about is Ruben. And so as I think about Ruben's role, Sonny mentioned the East Soybean Processing Tower that we dedicated on Wednesday. He also pointed out the North Corn Plant over here, the North Bean Plant, and the South Tower. And so Ruben manages the North Corn Plant for us. And so really what Ruben is doing is he's taking our first-in-class Escalate seed treatment package, and he's making sure that we deliver that with first-in-class efficiency and efficacy. And so as I think about that, the efficacy of making sure that every corn kernel that goes through the tower has the right amount of active ingredient on it. The efficiency of and making sure that the seed is processed in a timely manner, it's packaged, it's ready to go and be distributed. And so as I think about what Ruben does, we've actually got a dynamic duo of Tevelon brothers, okay, because Ruben's brother Frank manages our South Tower as well. And so each of those guys do an incredible job of impacting the farmer as we're processing seed through the winter months. Next person I'd like to talk about is Brad Fruth. And so Brad has been a part of our business for 17 years. And the first 15 years or so, Brad spent managing our information systems, our data, our technology, data security, things like that. And Brad stepped into a new role here about 2 years ago. And it's actually a new department for us, and that's an innovation department, and Brad serves as our innovation manager. And the thing that you've got to know about Brad is Brad loves his pigs, and he loves how those pigs taste, okay? And so if you like bacon or pork chops or pork burgers, Brad would be your best friend. And in fact, Brad and his wife Laura and their 4 girls have their own meat business. It's called Boiler Bacon Maker. And so I'd encourage you to look that up. But really, what I'm trying to represent here is I've had the privilege of seeing Brad be engaged in the agriculture industry for 17 years, ever since I've known Brad. And so about a month ago, I went to Brad and I was just asking, what are the projects that your innovation team is looking into? And so he's got a whole laundry list of things, but he's talking about, diesel engines run on ethanol. He's talking about automated forklifts. He's talking about dandelions used to make natural rubber, because a lot of the rubber here in the U.S. is all imported. And so there's a whole bunch of cool ideas. But then he talked about a subject that's garnered a lot more attention here of late, and that's this idea of climate and carbon programs. And so Brad made a really simple statement, but to me, I thought it was pretty profound. And what he said was, the farmer was the original environmentalist, As I took a second to think about that, I realized he's right. You know, Sonny talked about, we've got 30 years of no-till research. We've got crop rotation studies. We've got nitrogen application studies. You know, it's the farmer that's been entrusted to steward the soil that God has given us for decades and decades and decades. And so it's really about advocating on behalf of the farmer. And so as we think about vetting out these different carbon programs, or really any other type of program that may exist, what we're focused on is making sure that its result is more dollars, more reward in the piggy banks of farmers, instead of just simply serving corporate interest. And so that's really the mindset that Brad has brought to his team as they're engaged in all of these different programs and conversations. And so appreciate what Brad does in leading our business from an innovative standpoint. Next two guys I'd like to talk about are instrumental in our business, and they don't sell seed. But these two guys, Tim Stewart and John Bittler, have really been responsible for writing the foundational code of nearly every software system that exists here at Beck's. And there's two examples that you see there on the screen, Boss and Farm Server. Those are more of our customer-facing, dealer-engaging systems. But these guys have written codes for tens of other programs that exist in our business and help our people do their jobs and help them serve farmers. As I think about, you know, tracking the seed stock early on in the season with Tim Wisman, and then seeing it through the planting season and the growing season, and then harvest, and then back through the processing tower with Ruben or with Frank. And then, you know, after it's processed, bagged, and ready to go, back to Tim and our warehouse crew to be staged and then show up at the farm gate. You know, there's a lot of systems that exist in our business to track all of that, and there's been a lot of code written for that. But really, it's about more than the code. What it's about is a way that we can do business. And so think about if we had to go buy a software system off the shelf and then plug that into our business, and all of a sudden that software system is telling us how to run our business. Or we can engage with customers, with farmers, with dealers, with employees, and figure out what is the best way to run our business. And then Tim and John and the 70 other people that are on our technology team write the code, write the program, and we can run our business the right way. And so it's really a differentiator for us to have the talent that we do from a technology standpoint, and to be able to operate differently.
And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free.
So I 100% agree with that song. I'm very proud to be an American. I know many people in this room share that same pride. And it was about 6 weeks ago that I was thinking about something that, hey, you know, I'd really like for our country store to have more stuff that was made right here in the United States, or maybe made right down the street locally. And so as I was thinking about this idea, I decided to go and talk to my Aunt Kim Marchand. This is Sonny's daughter. She manages our country store. And so 6 weeks ago, I went and talked to her, and I said, hey, I've got this idea. I wonder if we can make it work. Could we get more items in our store that were made in America? And she said, well, you know, Corey, that's a really good idea. I actually had 2 meetings about that last week. I've got another one already scheduled for later this week, okay? And so I beat you to it, but we are on the same page. And so my Aunt Kim has worked really hard over the course of the last 6 weeks to make this a possibility. And so if you walk across the street to our country store, you will find an entire section of products that were made right here in America, maybe right down the street. So it's hats, it's shirts, it's different lotions, it's knives, you name it. There's a lot of things there. And so I found it really important to our business to be able to support our citizens here in the United States, fellow Americans, the people that are our neighbors right next to us. And so in addition to that, we're also working to set it up online on our website. So you'll be able to go to our website, click on the country store, there'll be a tab there that says Made in America. And so we're working on that. And the only items that are going to show up there are the items that were made right here in the U.S. And so with that, I just want to say thank you for coming and spending the day with us. Wish you a great time here, continued success, and safe travels going home. God bless.
And I won't forget the man who died, who gave that right to me, and I'm glad.
I'm Jason Gayheimer. I'm the PFR manager here at Beck's. I've been with Beck's for a little over 10 years now, all of which in practical farm research.
And I'm Aaron Carmer, practical farm research technician here in Atlanta. Been with Beck's a little over 6 years. A lot of that time spent in more the genetic testing side, but been with PFR here for about a year. So.
Yep. So if you guys notice, if you go out on the buggy tours or this nice looking show plot, Aaron and then Colin Shearer are the two guys who take care of this farm, plant the trials, and they do all the hard work, all the hard labor. So they make my life a lot easier. So I appreciate what Aaron and Colin do. So we're going to dive right into this presentation, and we're going to talk about everything planters. We're going to do that and try to do that in 45 minutes. You think we're going to cover everything to do with planters? Probably not. We're going to do our best, right? And we're going to talk about some of the things that you see up here that we have data on, and maybe touch on a few things that we don't have data that are really new. And then, like I said, we will answer any and all questions you have during or after the presentation. So we've built these bars, and we have, from my left to my right, your right to left, Kinsey bar, row units over here, John Deere, Precision Planting, White 9000 row units, Case row units, and Harvest International row units, okay? And so then what we did is we tried to put any and every planter attachment out there on the market, at least the most popular ones, on these bars so that we can talk about them. And then a lot of these things, like I said, we have data on a lot of these components. So here are the topics we're going to hit in that time period. So 1 through 7, we're going to hit these pretty fast. And then we're going to spend a little extra time at the very end on high speed because we have a pretty unique look into high-speed planting that I don't think a lot of other companies do. So I'm going to start off with closing wheels. So how many of you still have 2 solid rubber closing wheels? Okay, couple, right? That's fine. My number one thing that I go to, if you want to start spending money in your planter, we've tested a lot of different closing wheels over the course of 10 years, okay? And if you took all that data and put it together, every aftermarket closing wheel combination is better than 2 solid rubber closing wheels. There's better options out there. So that's where I like to start. If you need to start there, that's where I recommend you start on your planter. It's one of the things that are the best bang for your buck. And so these are the wheels that we have that are PFR proven, meaning they are wheels that we've tested for at least 3 years, and we've had a positive yield gain every year with these wheels, and then an average a positive ROI over that time as well. So these are anywhere from 5 to 3 bushel gain on corn. So how many of you are okay with 5 to 3 bushel gain on corn across all your acres, right? For $200 a row. It's like I said, it's the best bang for your buck if you're looking to add something. So these are great wheels. Soybeans, these are the 4 for us that are PFR proven on soybeans. With soybeans, we typically see maybe 2-3 bushel gains from different aftermarket closing wheels on soybeans. The graphs that we like to show, though, and we'll do this with a lot of equipment as it becomes PFR proven. Aaron's going to talk about some other things that we have acres to pay off on, okay? And so I like to show this graph because there's a lot of times where you probably look at some of this equipment and say, that is way too expensive, I'm not buying it, right? Has that ever happened to you? Everybody that's not saying yes is lying to me, okay? That's happened, right? And so that's making potentially a bad decision just by looking at the price tag saying it's too much. So we want to break it out by what's the size of your planter, what are you selling your grain for, and then what is the cost of this component, and then what is our yield gain that we've had, and we can figure it up on how many acres is it going to take to pay that investment off, and then you're getting pure gain from there, right? So 4.3 bushel, it doesn't take long to pay off some of this equipment. This one is actually the Schaffert 4-link closer, which we have right here to my left, and it is more of a system. So now we've tested a lot of individual wheels, and we're getting into testing systems, closing wheel systems, not just aftermarket wheels. So this is a system that is independent of what the row unit does. It has its own linkage, suspension. What we like about that is if you hit something with your row unit or it's got a little bit of a chatter in it, that will not be negative towards your closing wheel system. It has kind of, I'm going to say, its own suspension, if you will. So it stays grounded better regardless of what your row unit's doing. Soybeans, once again, it's a pretty quick payoff. We're looking at a year to at most maybe 2-year payoff for a lot of these attachments that maybe have a salty price tag in the beginning. So good results for a lot of these systems. Fast Track is another one. I'm kind of blocking it here. It's to my left on the stage. Didn't have enough room with all the other components we have on these bars to put everything on. But we get a lot of questions on case closing wheel systems. Have we ever tested them? The answer is no, because we do not have case closing systems our case planters in our PFR fleet. So we haven't ever actually tested the case closing system, but this is comparable. It is not. I'm not going to tell you it's the same because it isn't, but it's pretty close to what you might expect if you took that case closing system off and put it on a different planter. Now, Case will tell you, and I agree with them, that their system works really good as a whole with how they do their gauge wheels and other things. It's a systems approach there, but this is a good option if you're looking for something other than two solid rubber closing wheels, and maybe you don't like some of these aftermarket spike type wheels. This is a good option to run with here. We've had good success with it, and you can see here once again, acres to pay off aren't too harmful. Soybeans as well, and it's only a bushel. So how many of you get real excited when I say it's a bushel? Not a lot, especially if it's got a salty price tag on it. But if I say, hey, it might take you 800, maybe 1,000 acres to pay this off, and then it's going to last for a long time, and you're going to gain a bushel on beans, say $10 at least every year, every acre, that's a good investment, right? So it's a different way, it's a better way of looking at things to make a better decision. FurrowForce is the newest system we're looking at. We actually have it up here. It's actually on, and so you may not be able to hear it, but it's fighting me, okay? So this system is actually going to monitor itself from the cab. So you can get it fully automated, right? And so you've got a two-stage system. The front stage is going to crumble, move that soil inward. The back station is going to put pressure down, and it's always going to automate how much pressure it's putting down as it goes through the field. So you can constantly get that correct amount of pressure to eliminate air pockets and have good seed to soil contact throughout the field. So obviously, as we keep getting more and more advanced in this technology and what these things can do, the price tag starts going up more and more, right? So this is the first year last year was the first year we have tested FurrowForce. And so we only have 1 year data for it, but it is very comparable on corn and soybean to some of these other things. But what I want to point out is any of the things that we're testing maybe in plots, and we try to do these in longer plots, you can probably take it and add a couple bushels to it when you take it field scale. Anything that's fully automated or has an automated component to it, when you take it away from a nice uniform flat plot and then go test it in a field that's got more variability, you're going to see a bigger gain from things like FurrowForce from a field scale perspective than what maybe we do in the PFR trials.
Thanks, Jason. So we're going to go ahead and start looking at some starter fertilizer systems now. And when I say starter fertilizer systems, we're more specifically going to be looking at 2x2x2 systems compared to maybe just a 2x2 system. So if you look here on the left, that was kind of like our standard PFR Proven practice, doing 30 units, 2x2 with your planter, with just some UAN, 28% or 32%, something like that. And we were getting, if you look there, you'll see that preferential root growth down on that left side. And that's something that we want to try and avoid, even tying back into Jason's closing wheel talk. If you have just a spiked wheel on one side and maybe a solid rubber on the other, you're going to get that same thing. So that led us to, maybe we should try putting this on both sides of the row. So we did 30 units, still the same amount of nitrogen, going on both sides of the row, and we're able to pick up, 6 bushel. So the next step from that was maybe we should be putting on a little bit more with the planter. So we switched to this 60 units, 2x2x2, and we're able to pick up another bushel and a half actually. So if you currently right now aren't doing anything with your planter as far as a 2x2 or a 2x2x2 system, you can easily expect probably 10 bushels to the acre yield advantage by switching to one of these 2x2x2 systems. Have some 4-year multi-location data here on this, comparing these 2x2x2 versus just 30 units of 2x2. And as you can see, every year this has paid for us, even in 2019, which I'm sure you guys probably remember 19. That was not a fun year. That was a wet year. Around here, we didn't get started planting until early June, and a lot of things really didn't pay off for us in the PFR plots like they do normally, and this was still able to pay off for us. So, and another thing to keep in mind here is this is actually data composed of like 3 different systems. So we've got, where is it at here? We've got the Yetter version over here, and we tested the Martin Dual UMO system and the Precision Planting Conceal system, and all this data is basically all 3 of those compiled together because they basically mirrored each other. As long as you're getting that nitrogen down incorporated into the soil, they're all doing the same thing and getting this advantage for us. So like I talked about, the Yetter system right over there, it's maybe one of the cheaper systems, but still does a really good job. If you see here, 550 corn on a 16-row planter, it's going to take you a little over 200 acres to pay that off. So, that's easy money right there. And then this is our personal favorite here. I would say most of the PFR guys are probably going to recommend this system to you, is the Precision Planning Dual Conceal. So that's what we run on our planter here in Atlanta. We run anything from no-till, conventional till, strip till, and we don't have any issues running these. So as you can see, it's got a split gauge wheel design. It's on this Precision Planning unit right here. So once your gauge wheel comes up, that knife's going to dig down into the ground and get it probably 1 inch to 2 inches down in the ground. So these systems say 2 by 2, but you're not really getting quite 2 inches on a lot of those. But as long as you're getting it in the soil, Mother Nature's probably going to do the rest and get it down there to those roots. Downforce, I'm not going to touch on this a whole lot because Jason's going to talk about it later on with the high speed, but something we definitely want to look at. So how many of you guys are still running spring down pressure on your planters? Okay, how about air? Anybody running air? Okay, a few more hands. Anybody running hydraulic downforce already? Good, I like to see that, that's good. So some major benefits to the hydraulic downforce is uniform planing depth, more even emergence, and it's really going to help in a lot of those variable fields where you might be going from some lighter soils to some heavier soils. So we see a lot of advantages using these systems over a spring or even an air, and the hydraulic downforce is actually probably going to be the number 2 thing we recommend the guys do to their planter after some closing wheels, because you can spend all the money you want on this guy right here and try and get the best singulation in the world, but if your planter unit doesn't have a good ride and you're bouncing across that field, the second that seed hits that seed tube, you're negating everything that fancy meter's doing for you. So the hydraulic downforce is a must in our opinion. We've got some data here, 2-year multi-location on corn. One thing I want you guys to keep in mind here, you can see we're comparing this to a 50-pound, 125-pound, and a 250-pound manual setting, just to kind of mimic some standard spring pressures that you might have on planters. But we're also setting this is a static pressure on a hydraulic cylinder. So that's still going to be a lot better than, say, a 50-pound spring. So if you're still running springs, your numbers here for all these manual settings are probably going to be lower, and your advantage to running this hydraulic downforce in the automated setting is going to be even better. You can see here, this is just kind of showing us why we need that automated setting set up on our planters. We can try and guess what we need to be running. So maybe you think, okay, 50 pounds manual setting in this field, I think it'd be pretty good. Well, obviously it was not here. Look at the automated, a lot better looking corn. Maybe 125, nope, same thing. Turns out the computer knows how to read what kind of downforce it needs better than we do. Soybeans, not as good of a yield bump as in corn, but it's still there. And so definitely still looking at and soybeans as well. Looking at some row cleaners now. So main purpose of row cleaners, obviously move that residue out of the row, try and minimize how much hairpinning we got going on, maybe warm the soil up a little bit faster, and help with that emergence. So sometimes we get questions, should I be running a no-till coulter? In our opinion, as long as you've got a good set of row cleaners and they're set up properly, you should never need a no-till coulter. You can just yank that off your planter. So some corn data here, 2-year multi-location. As you can see, some pretty good advantages to running row cleaners. And I should tell you that this is data from no-till situations. Probably not going to be as good in the conventional till system, but we still see some benefits to running row cleaners in a conventional system. Also looking here, you see 25 pounds of down pressure compared to just a floating row cleaner, and we see an advantage there too. And the reason that we think we see a lot of that yield bump comes from these next slides. So I don't know about where you guys farm, but we deal with some slugs and insect pressure here on this farm. And you look here, we've got a lot of residue in the row packed around that corn plant. It's a great place for those slugs and insects to hide during the day when it's nice and hot. Then when the evening comes, they can come right out and start feeding on our plants. So going to a floating situation, we're getting a little more of that residue out of the row. We've got a little less feeding on the corn plant there. It's still some residue around there. If we go to 25 pounds of down pressure using a pneumatic system on our row cleaners, we're moving all of that fodder out of the way, and look at that corn plant. We don't have any kind of damage from slugs or insects. We don't have a whole bunch of fodder laying around that corn plant. So we think that's where a lot of that yield comes from, and that advantage to running some down pressure on your row cleaners. Just looking at some soybean data here, decent little gains running row cleaners on soybeans. And one thing to keep in mind here is, like I said, we're doing this in no-till situations, and when we do these soybean studies, we're actually just using RTK, bumping over 15 inches, and splitting our corn rows from the year before. So we're not having to move stalks as much and root balls. We're just basically moving some of those shucks that are laying out there from last year. If you're one of those guys that's planting beans on an angle, you're going to see a great advantage to running 25 pounds of down pressure on that row cleaner. Because if you're just, say you're floating every time you hit those old corn rows, that row cleaner is going to bounce up, and you're not going to get as much residue moved out of the row. So no-till, going at an angle, great results with 25 pounds of down pressure on those. And last thing I'm going to hit on here is disc openers. So how many of you guys have heard of the STP disc openers? Got a couple hands out there. Okay. Is anybody here actually using them on their planter? No? Okay. So we tested these here, and I've got them over here on this Taller Harvest International unit if you want to look at it afterwards here. And we saw about a 2 bushel increase in corn using these. And does anybody want to guess what worked better, or where these worked better, in no-till or in a conventional till system? Anybody? No-till? Yeah, that's basically what we would assume as well, and that's going into it, that's what we figured it would be. But the results basically mimicked each other in no-till and conventional till, which was surprising for us. So the way these work, it's basically a serrated disc opener, and one of them is actually slightly bigger than the other. So it's going to be turning a little bit faster, which kind of creates almost a cutting with these. So that's going to help reduce some of that sidewall compaction we may get from a normal disc opener. And it's also going to help maybe cut some of that residue that normally we would just hairpin down into the furrow. We can maybe cut it a little bit more with these. So great yield here. Soybeans, not as much of an advantage, but still 1.5 bushels. And so it's something worth looking into. One downfall to these is going to be, we do hear that people say they may not last as long as, say, a standard disc opener, but they're able to go 2 or 3 changes and keep these hubs and just change out the disc blade. So, if you think you want to gain 2 bushel roughly on corn and have the time to change out your disc openers maybe a little more often, then it's something to look at. And we've actually had a guy in Colfax, Iowa, tell me a couple weeks ago, he has almost 500 row unit acres on these on his planter, planting with no trash wheels on there at all, and planting into a lot of heavy cover and a lot of sod. And he loves these things. And so for him to get 500 row acres on that, I mean, that's 12 row planter, that's 6,000 acres that he's ran on these. So I think it just depends on the situation, how much life you're going to get out of these. So if it's something you think you want to try, maybe throw on 2 or 3 rows worth on your planter and give it a whirl. I'm going to turn it back to Jason now.
All right, we're gonna hit real quick on depth controls. Anyone heard of precision planting, smart depth? Right, a couple of us have smart firmer, things like that. So we've got a good amount of data on depth, right? We've got 4 years of data. Notice, if this was all positive for 2 inches, this would be PFR Proven planting depth. But do you think I'm going to sit up here and tell you to plant 2 inches every time you go out and plant corn? Does anybody do that? Does anybody plant the same depth across all your acres all the time? Sometimes? Well, you must be lucky. A lot of us probably can't or maybe shouldn't do that. I know I'm one of those. So, but what this does tell us is 2 inches is a great starting point, right? If you've got adequate moisture, and that's a good place to start there, but make sure you're constantly checking, adjusting as needed, depending on conditions changing. Beans, it's 1.5 inches for us, right? But where we want to really talk is next generation of being able to make sure we are planting at the correct depth. And part of that's just having vision into that furrow. So Smart Firmer can give us that vision. It obviously will show you a lot of different things in the cab. It measures a lot of different parameters. But my favorite parameter that it measures is furrow moisture. So being able to see if you have good moisture right where you're dropping that seed from the cab at all times. Does anybody like when your monitor turns red for something? Nobody. That drives me nuts. Well, because I don't think any of us will just keep keep going and let it beep at us or let it be red or whatever the case may be, right? So first time we were using Smart Firmer, was planting a bean field. It was really hot that day, right? And so we started, and I had good depth. I had good soil moisture. It was green. After lunch, it turned red on me, right? So I'm like, ooh, okay, well, maybe it is getting pretty dry. So I stopped, went back, dug. It had gotten extremely dry. Went down another ½ inch, was back into good moisture. Monitor said so as well. Finished planting that field. At emergence, you could tell right where I stopped that planter because I stopped it in the middle of the field, and you could tell right where I stopped. Better emergence, better stand, quicker emergence, right? And so then the yield monitor told me that same thing. I made a great decision by doing that. Would I have done that otherwise? No, there's no way. I might have planted 2 or 3 more fields before I adjusted, honestly, and I think we're all in that boat. So just being able to have the visibility to make a better decision on the fly, I think is extremely important. Now, do we need to take it to the next level and utilize smart depth? I don't know, right? But what it can do is it can put us, if you have a fields that are really, really variable, right, and soil moisture is going to vary a lot within them soil types in that field. What you can do is you can set a parameter. Say, I don't want you to go any shallower than 1 inch. I don't want you to go any deeper than 3 inches, but I want you to target this percentage of soil moisture, and it'll fight to find that nice percentage of soil moisture in that range at all times. So, like I said, it's a nice feature. Is it necessary? Is it really going to put money back in our pocket? We don't know yet. We haven't tested it, but I like where they're going with it. And like I said, I really like the visibility with Smart Firmer alone from a furrow moisture standpoint. So seed orientation, going to hit on this pretty quick as well, but it's something really revolutionary, I think, that we're looking at. How many of you have seen data on seed orientation? Quite a few of us, right? Anywhere from 2 to 29% yield gains from seed orientation could be huge, right? You know why there's this huge swing and how profitable it could be? Does anybody know why? Because it's all been hand planted. It's all been hand planted, a lot of it probably by interns, right? The hand planted and done quick, and it's really small plots, okay? So, well, if one ear is bad, and it throws that data one extreme or another, right? So you have to do this in longer stretches, which is why we conduct our research in longer stretches than most, heavily replicated. But there's never been a technology out there to do it that way, right? Well, we have that technology, and it's called AeroTube. There's a display up here. I might even turn it on here in a second, and I've got one up here I'll hold. But MK1 Engineering, I think the guys are in the crowd right now, to be honest, so I better not screw this up, right? But this is their design right now. It's I'm going to say it's alpha testing, probably not even beta testing. They know they've got some work to do, but it worked great for us. The 2 things they said that it would do when they came to us was it will orient flats tip down, 70+% of the time. Okay, and then what that'll translate to, if that happens, is more often than not quicker, more uniform emergence. Okay, right? Because your shoot's going to shoot up and your root's going to shoot straight down. Nothing has to curl like the picture on your left. The other thing they said it would do is more often than not, you'd have consistent leaf architecture like the picture on your right. Okay, so a lot of companies come to me every year and say, I got this product that's going to do this, this, and this, right? And a lot of times it doesn't pan out. Okay, so this is pretty revolutionary and pretty new. So obviously I was a little skeptical, but it sounded like these guys knew what they were up to. And so we tested it at Henderson, Kentucky, here, Atlanta, Indiana. It's on tour buggy number 3 if you want to go see that trial. And then we tested at Gibbon, Minnesota. And so here's a look at it as well. And there's one of the seeds we randomly dug, tipped down, right? So what's awesome about this is we were able to ground truth it. Now, the one thing I told these guys would happen is if we plant this on PFR farms, we're going to take a lot of pictures, and good, bad, in between, I'm going to show everyone what it did, okay? And so here was a great observation from Gibbon, Minnesota. On the right-hand side, you can see more quicker, more uniform emergence. Why? Because more percentage of those tips were straight down, and it got out of that ground faster. The next one's Henderson, Kentucky. At Henderson, we didn't actually see much difference in emergence, but what did we see? That leaf architecture consistency that they talked about. And it may be a little hard to see in this picture, but it was way more consistent where we used AeroTube versus where we didn't. So it's really awesome to be able to have a technology out there that can do this mechanically on a planter, and it can do it right here. And as it starts to drop seed, you can see how it's orienting them. And it's giving us a percentage down here. It's still going fast. It's hard even for the high-speed camera to catch it. But it's giving us a percentage. We are still getting 80+% of those seeds oriented tip down, right? So they know they want to get that to 95+. And they also want to make sure they can do it fast and they can do all seed types. But this is the furthest anyone I know of is on the market with something that is going to be able to orient seeds tip down. All right, and we'll have time up here, like I said before. If you guys want to come up and look at things, we'll run that again as well. So I want to spend the last probably 15 or so minutes on high-speed planning. Anybody have a high-speed planner in here? Do you like it? Yeah, okay. I've asked this I don't know how many times over the course of the last 3, 4, 5 years, and I'm probably up to 1,000 people or more, and I haven't had a single guy tell me, I bought a high-speed planner and it's or I don't like it. It's, yeah, I like it, or I love it, every single time, okay? And we're probably going to show you why throughout this presentation. So one of the things I'm going to say is you can't use this tractor to go high speed. You need this one, okay? We got to go really fast, okay? No, I'm just kidding. But that is one of the things that everybody, when high-speed planning came out, the first thing everybody said, I can't go 10 mile an hour. I don't have the horsepower. I can't go 10 in my no-till fields. All the excuses in the book started coming out on why we can't go that fast or why we don't need to go that fast, right? Well, I guess if you want to put your pulling tractor on it, you can, but I probably wouldn't recommend that. So there are 3 on the marketplace now for to be able to do high speed. So Ag Leader Sure Speed, John Deere ExactEmerge, and Precision Planting Speed Tube. And so we have them all up here, and they're on one of these bars, and I also have some of the delivery systems on the table. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about each one. And I'm first going to start off with Precision Speed Tube, and it's probably the one. It is the one we have the most experience with, the most data on. We're on year 3 of testing it, and I'm going to show some of that data here later on. But obviously, it's paired with their VSET meter. It's a 12-volt system, and I'm going to give you a little look at it here if you haven't seen it. So this is the inside look of the actual delivery system, right? So you've got the VSET meter up here. It's dropping that seed right here, and these fingers are then grabbing that seed, putting it in this belt, and taking it and delivering it down, right? All the way down to where you're dropping that seed instead of free-falling that seed. And so you can see a cost breakdown. I probably wouldn't take this to the bank because this is probably already unavailable or the price is going to double over the course of the next year or two, just like everything else, right? But this is kind of a snapshot of what it has been for the complete system, minus the Gen 3 display, okay? And then obviously, if you've already got a Gen 3, the harness, the VSET meters, just to add speed tube to that is probably roughly around $1,000 a row. So if you're already most of the way there, this is probably the system you're going to end up choosing if you want to go high speed. The John Deere ExactEmerge, it's obviously the most different from probably the other 2. And it was one of the first ones out on the market, but it's a brush delivery system, right? So it is right here on this planter unit, and it has a bowl-shaped disc. And this brush takes it off of that bowl-shaped disc. So it transfers it from the disc right onto the brush and delivers it right down to that furrow, right? Okay, and so here's some other details around that. It is the price tag on it is a little higher. You cannot do this with a row unit that is older than an ME5, okay? It can't be done, and we tried. And we tore that guy up. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the end. We didn't do it with ExactEmerge. We put speed tube on this old shank, and we tore it up. So, got to have the right shanks on these. So there's some details around that. The new kid on the block now is Ag Leader Sure Speed. It's on the far right bar on the Kinsey display here, and so it looks like this. So I'm going to say it's a little bit of a hybrid of the other 2. And the reason I'm going to say that is when it comes off of that plate, it's putting it into these brushes here. And the brushes are then transferring it to the belt to deliver it down, okay? And one of the things that we do also like about this one is it delivers it right at the very bottom. So does John Deere. Those 2 probably deliver it a little bit lower than Speed Tube maybe. Not that that's probably going to matter a lot. But it delivers it really far down into that trench. You can see here $3,300 a row for the complete system minus the display. Agfinity is a great feature that they have as well. It's their cloud-based mapping software also. So this is the newest one. We tested it this year. That's where I think we have a unique position. I don't care which one you buy. I personally don't. I don't care if you buy one or not. I'm going to recommend high speed, and I'm going to show you why, but we have a complete unbiased look on this, and I think we're the only company that's testing all 3 to be able to give you somewhat of a comparison here. So Aaron talked about hydraulic downforce. So I think hydraulic downforce is an absolute must on every planter, regardless of how fast you're going. But it has to happen when you're going above 5 mile an hour. You cannot have a high-speed planter without hydraulic downforce. So these are just some unique observations that we were able to pull from some of our maps. So we did the ag leader in some different tillage practices. So we put it into conventional, strip till, and no-till fields when we did this field scale testing. And we did this testing in Western Illinois. Okay, so this particular field was spring conventional tillage, and it took on average 43 pounds of down pressure. Okay? What's unique about this, though, is it also, if you see the dark green bar where it's a negative 260 to negative 6, there was almost 5 acres that actually needed lift, not down. Okay? So if you have springs, are they going to lift up when it needs to be lifted? You have to have fully automated. Even when it was going at 5 mile an hour in parts of this field, there was that scenario. You can also see a pretty unique observation where in the center we had to plant around a power pole. Okay, well, early spring, they had to come in and do some work to that, and they did it in the mud, right? That's always awesome when they drive through your field like that, when they have that right of way. Did it in the mud, okay, packed it down. They field cultivated through it, but look at the hydraulic. It took so much hydraulic downforce because of that compaction, right? And springs aren't going to do that. They're not going to find that. They're not going to adjust differently for that. Fall strip till. So before we were at 40, 43, 45 average. When we were planting into some fall strip till strips, it took more. On average, it took us 113 pounds of down pressure. Okay? And then this is just a look at how it changes as you go faster. It takes more down pressure on average as you go faster to try to keep that same gauge wheel downforce that we want across all the acres. It has to be able to adjust on the fly. This is even more unique situation. How many of you that have conventional tillage, do you always cultivate at the same angle at which you're planting? Some of you do. Some of you maybe don't do it with auto steer, and you're probably definitely not, right? To some degree. And then some of you may actually do it on an angle on purpose. Well, so we did that. We came in and we did cultivated straight, and we did cultivated at an angle. Then we actually ended up letting it set, and we planted it into stale seed bed. And so you can see here 59 average for the down pressure needed for cultivating straight. When we cultivated at an angle, 88. So just changing, that was the only management practice that was different between these two fields. That was it. So even by doing something as minute as that, makes a world of difference when it comes to your down pressure. And these are just great examples of why we have to have hydraulic automated downforce. And that's whether it was 5 mile an hour or not. That was regardless of high speed. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of our results with our high-speed research. So these are stand counts. Now, the one thing I want you to keep in mind is speed tube, the field we took these counts of, was planted at 34,000. Okay? Exact emerge was 35,000. And sure speed was 34,000. So the planting pops on these particular fields I'm showing were different. Okay? But what I really want to show is the fact that it doesn't get worse. A lot of guys will say, well, this technology isn't perfect. If once you get up to 10 mile an hour, you can't get the same stands. You can. In fact, actually, some of them got better. Okay? So from a singulation standpoint, and the one thing I want to reiterate on this is not singulation taken out of the monitor. This is not what it's reading, dropping it. This is us ground truthing it. This is our up and out of the ground truth singulation and spacing. So we went out and we counted thousands upon thousands of plants in all of these research fields, okay, to come up with these numbers. These are incredible numbers. These are the type of numbers you're going to see when you're getting from your planter. But like I said, this is out of the ground. And so how we did that is we went out, we had to measure a lot of this stuff, and anywhere that we counted doubles, we counted skips, anything that was out of place. But the one thing we had to do to ground truth this properly, what did we have to do when there was a skip? We had to dig and see if there was a seed there, right? Because if there was a seed there, it shouldn't be a knock against the planter, right? So we dug a lot of seeds, okay? So this is, like I said, this is really excellent data for ground truth out of the ground for these three technologies. So across the board here, what? Maybe 1% difference between all these technologies in terms of how they perform. Okay, that's why if you guys want recommendations on which one, I'm going to talk about other things. I'm not going to go and sit here and say this one is better, because it's not. They all perform statistically the same. They all perform the way every company says they perform. So if you're looking at one and you want a recommendation, we're going to talk about other things. I'm going to ask you what you currently have on your planter. I'm going to ask you, what do you want to put on your planter down the road? Is it going to be compatible with one or all of these? Those are the things we're going to talk about, and that's why. So I want to work through this. This is going to be a little bit of a long scenario here, but what I want to do is I want to use our 2-year data that we have on SpeedTube to do a real-life data set on return, what you can expect from a return standpoint by going to high-speed planting. So you can see here, I have this conversation all the time too. We're gaining a bushel or two by doing the same thing at 5 mile an hour. Why? Because we're replacing that seed tube. We're taking that free fall seed tube off of there, and we're putting a system on there that delivers it to the ground exactly how it singulated it from the meter, right? So we're eliminating that free fall. Obviously, we are going to get better spacing regardless of what speed we're going. What I like to point out is for 2 years multi-location, we've only lost 0.8 of a bushel from 5 to 10 mile an hour, 0.8. Okay, so statistically, that's not really a big difference there. Okay, I'm not worried about that, and I'm going to show you why. Let's do an example here with a 16-row planter, 5 mile an hour. Okay, and then we've got a 24-row planter. So if you want to cover more acres quicker, you got a couple options. You can buy another planter, you can buy a bigger planter, or you can put high speed on your planter. So we can plant about 50% more acres per hour if we go from a 16 to a 24-row. If we take that same 16 row and we put high speed on it, whichever one of these you want to choose, I'm just using SpeedTube as this example, 60% at 8 mile an hour, okay? So that's not 10. That's going on average 3 more mile an hour faster, okay? And we can pick up 60%. How many of you want to plant 60% more acres per hour? Anybody? Okay, there's a ton of liars in here. I only saw like 3 hands. Come on. We all want to do that, right? For multiple reasons. I think we know, and I'm going to show data that planting early pays. But the second thing is, now we can be more patient. You can let your neighbor get out there and play in the mud, and you can watch him do it, and then you start planting after him, and you still beat him done, right? But you plant it into better conditions, and you'll have better stands. So I'm going to work through an example of a grower that has 4,000 acres, and we're going to say he's doing 2,000 acres of corn, 2,000 acres of beans, and we're going to use a 12-hour day. We're going to say he plants 12 hours. And it would take him roughly, when we figure that, with a 16 row at 5 mile an hour, it'll take roughly 20 days to plant those acres. With the high speed going 8 mile an hour, we've cut her down to about 12 and a half days of time. You think that's going to matter some years? Okay, now heads are going, yeah, because you remember 2019, don't you? Yeah, it mattered then, didn't it? Okay, so here we're going to use some 2019 data for this example. We're going to use the USDA's days suitable for field work to figure out what this return could be for us. So we're using a real-life example. So in April here, we were 20% less time in the field because of Mother Nature alone. 50% less for May. It didn't get better in June, did it? We just had to get in there and slam it in at some point. Okay, so these are the windows that we really had 3 windows of opportunity here on this farm. And I kind of circled them here. Okay, and that first window was about 4.5 days. I think the second one was around 5.5, and then we had a little more time there in that other window, but it just kept raining, didn't it? And we had short windows to try to plant. How many of you were planting through the night? A lot of us were planting through the night. We didn't have a choice. Okay, so we're going to use our 17-year multi-location corn data, and you can see here this is a percent of average yield. So obviously it pays to plant earlier, but I'm going to pick out those 3 windows that I just had circled with this yield data. Those are those 3 planting date windows I said we had an opportunity to plant in. And I'm just going to start with 200 bushel. I'm going to say that first planting for us, which was going to be on average our highest yielding corn, we're going to start at 200 bushel there. And then I'm going to take off the percentage based off of our data, what we would expect to lose, based off of that 17-year data set percentage-wise. So then anything planted in that second window is 193, the third window is 161. Let's do the same thing with beans. Planting early on beans actually means more than planting early on corn for us. It's more of this type of slope that happens as time goes on. It goes down for us, okay? And so let's look at those 3 windows again. We'll start with 65 bushel as our starting point, and then we lose from there, okay? So how many of you want to be planting in June instead of April? Beans, not me. It drives me nuts when I hear guys say towards the end of May, well, I got my corn in the ground. Well, what about your beans? I still got to plant my beans. I'll get them. But that's why it drives me nuts. I want everybody to say, I got my corn and beans done, or I got a lot of my beans done. Honestly, it means more to get those beans in. And that's what this high-speed situation is going to be able to do for us. So here's how long it takes. 4.5 days, 5 days, and 11.5 days were those 3 windows I talked about. Remember, we're going to plant our corn first in this situation. This grower has 1 planter. He likes to plant all his corn first and his beans. So we're going to work through that 2,000 acres of corn, 2,000 acres of beans. So it took him until that 3rd window to finish planting corn. Had to plant all those beans in June, like we just talked about not wanting to do. But if he was able to go 8 mile an hour, okay, could have gotten done with his corn in that 2nd window and plant just over half his beans in that 2nd window. You think that's going to pencil out to be a decent return? I think it's going to, okay? So right here are those returns. If this was a corn planter only situation, if this was a guy who just planted corn with that planter and he did have a 2nd planter, that's still $30,000, over $30,000 return for that 1 year, okay? But if it's the situation I talked about and he has 1 planter and he plants his corn and his beans, that's a little bit of money, isn't it? This is real data. Every bit of this situation is real data. So when guys say high speed's too expensive, or I can't do it because of this, or I can't do it because of that, let's talk through that. Let's figure out how we can do it. Even if you're going 1 or 2 mile an hour faster, it means a big deal, right? For 2 reasons. Planting early, and then maybe being a little more patient, which I'm bad about that. I want to get out there and go, right? But if we can go faster, we can cover acres faster, we can afford to be a little more patient and only be out there when it's fit to be out there. So let's put this all together here. I like doing puzzles, okay? And we've talked a lot. I've talked to a couple people already this morning about other things. You can't just put some of this technology on your planner and go, and it work, and you're doing the right thing. You got to be out making sure all these pieces of this puzzle come together correctly. It takes a lot more, maybe getting out of the tractor, digging, looking, adjusting, tweaking, but you got to start with the right foundation as well. Okay, RTK guidance, pretty helpful when you're going 10 mile an hour, right? I really don't want to rip them marker arms off, okay? Horsepower, it does take more horsepower. There's no denying that. We got to have that, okay? High-speed delivery system, you have to have a high-speed delivery system to go 10 mile an hour. You're not going to be planting corn 10 mile an hour without it. High-speed or a high-capacity fertilizer. You know, Aaron talked a lot about 2x2x2. That's been the most consistent, biggest bang for our buck thing that we've done over the course of the last 4 years. If you were doing that and now you're thinking about going to high speed and you're thinking about cutting that out because you don't think you can do it anymore, let's talk about how we can still do it, okay? Because there's still a lot of money to be had by putting starter on both sides of the road, whether you're going 5 or 10 mile an hour. We need to still be doing it. Hydraulic capacity of that tractor, that's a big one. The tractor we had on the Sure Speed planter in Illinois, we were maxing that thing out with hydraulic capacity, so we really got to pay attention to what it's going to take to run everything. Proper maintenance. You know, we talk about this guy right here, making sure everything's maintenance properly, okay? Hydraulic downforce, absolute must, no-brainer in my mind. Durable row unit, okay? This guy, not going to cut the mustard. Every row unit you see up here is capable of doing high speed, okay? But anything like a John Deere 7200, probably even not a Case 1250, a lot of these older row units are not able to do, you can't just go and put high speed on them and it be fine. You're going to blow it apart like we just about did this guy right here, okay? And then the other things, adjustable row cleaners, we got to have that. That's another thing I get it. They're like, I can't do 10 mile an hour no-till because my row cleaners will just plow through everything. Well, you got to have adjusted right. You got to have the right type of row cleaners, and you got to pay attention to those things that can be done. We did it. Strong toolbar, got to have that. Good field conditions, that's where I talked about. Now that we can get our acres covered quicker, we have the opportunity to be a little more patient, make sure we're out there when we should be out there. And then aftermarket closing wheels, which are my favorite. Okay, so that puts that all together. This is us with the ExactEmerge planter. It's just a couple miles away from here, a 40-acre field. This is where we did 10 mile an hour, okay? So those that say I can't do 10 mile an hour in no-till, you can do 10 mile an hour in no-till. Because those counts that you saw that I showed you from the ExactEmerge that were beautiful stand counts, beautiful singulation, that was taken from this, okay? Everything's got to come together though, right? We got to be paying attention to maintenance. We got to be even more particular, and all the pieces of that puzzle have to come together to be able to do high speed successfully, but it can be done. Now, that was everything planners in 43 minutes.
My name is Nate Furley. I am the Regional Agronomy Manager here at Beck's Hybrids for our Western region. Our Western region is Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, as well as Wisconsin. Now, I hesitate when I say Wisconsin because I grew up in central Minnesota, and so during football season, we kind of have this hard line there between our borders. But no, all jokes aside, what we see in the Western region is a lot of diversity. We see relative maturity ranges from a 85-day corn down to, in my region, our fullest corn sold. Soybeans ranging from a 3.9 down to a 0.9. Okay, so a lot of diversity. I'm from the West. I'm here in the East talking about planting depth because it doesn't matter what our soils are, doesn't matter where we're farming. Planting depth is a decision that we can make that has a big impact on our final outcome. So we tend to, within planting date, fall back upon what I call an emotional decision. Okay? This is how deep I plant my corn. That to me is an emotional decision. When I ask farmers, how deep are you planting your crop? I want to know in inches. I don't want to know in knuckles. Okay? I want to know in inches. And so the reason we tend to fall back on that is because when we look at practical farm research data over the last 8 years, we see potential ranges from year to year of a 20 bushel spread on corn and a 6 bushel spread on soybeans. On today's market, that can be an $80 decision. How much does it cost us per acre to make a planting depth decision? How much is it going to cost me right here to go and change this from here to there? How much money did I just put into that? Nothing. Zero. Okay? It's a zero input cost that can make us a lot of money. And so today my goal is to provide you with 5 factors to consider when we're making those planting depth decisions every year. Before I get into that, allow me to tell a quick story. Anyone recognize what's up here on the screen? Something we all wish we were sitting in right now. Be maybe a more enjoyable presentation if we were sitting in a pool. That's a diving board. I grew up in a small town, Fairfax, Minnesota, and we're fortunate enough to have a community pool. Still exists today. And we had 2 diving boards. And I can distinctly remember being pretty afraid of this diving board. And the fear that I had from this diving board, though, it wasn't from what we see above the water, but rather it was what we have to jump into off of the diving board, which is 12 feet of water. 12 feet of water to jump into is a little bit intimidating for a young child. We had a rule at that swimming pool that you couldn't jump off the diving board until you went through your first year of swimming lessons. I'll tell you how small Fairfax is. We didn't have a wristband, okay, that said a different color whether you had gone through or not. No, Emily up there on the tower, she just knew whether or not you had been through those swimming lessons. I bring that up because Emily and the other lifeguards had a process to build that confidence and to build that reassurance so the fear would disperse, so that jumping off that diving board is a little more fun. Swimming in the deep water was all right. So my question to you today is, are we afraid of the depths? Do we have a little bit of a fear of putting that seed too deep? My hope is that fear changes to confidence. Okay, we don't need fear. We don't have a spirit of fear. But I hope the concern changes from, what if I don't put it deep enough? What if my seed isn't into moisture? What if the conditions aren't allowing for that plant to develop properly? So that leads me into factor number 1, and the main reason why I selected this topic was what I scouted dozens of times this year. Up on the screen, you can see on your right, decent stand, on our left, not so good. This is a side-by-side that we planted in the Minnesota Practical Farm Research location, where I asked Blake to go out and plant a 2.5 inch and a 2 inch planting depth in an area that we had. Okay, so we planted this late. But I wanted to do it as a demonstration because this is what we saw pretty consistent. Okay, we saw these sporadic stands, and it all had to do with the improper planting depth. I like to do something in most of my presentation that's build up to the data and information, but we're going to get right into the data and information. Because my thought process is when I see our multi-location, multi-year data, I have 3 years here. If you stay for Jason's presentation next, he's actually going to put 4 years up there. Both say our best yield is at 2 inches on corn and 1.5 inches on soybeans. These factors I'm going to discuss aren't going to push us any shallower than 2 inches or any shallower than 1.5 inches. They're going to discuss the reasons why we may want to make that decision to go a little bit deeper in the right year or on that year like this in certain areas. Okay, so I look at this data set and I think, wow, 7.7 bushels on corn, putting that seed down at 3 inches. But what really stands out is it's a 6.5 bushel advantage over the 2-inch planting depth. Okay, so we look at 6.5 bushels. How come we don't have an ROI on here? Tim? We don't have an input cost, right? It costs us 0, right? That's the thing to take home on this. It doesn't cost us anything to go change that. It may cost time if we have a 48-row planter, okay? We might have a few minutes involved in that. But we look at 7.7 or 6.5 bushels, that's really nice. We add the next year in there, 2018, and we see a flatline trend. I like finding these trends. You look at this and say, that doesn't look too impressive, just dealing with a half a bushel or so, okay? But that half a bushel or so is telling me I can play in those depths and have confidence that I won't lose anything, okay? What about this gem? We're not just going to talk corn here today. We're going to talk soybeans as well. Now, I really enjoy presenting here in Indiana because I don't have to wear one of those bulletproof vests for the next comment I'm going to wear. In Iowa, I'll get shot. I'll get things thrown at me. I tend to like soybeans better than I like corn, okay? I think we've done some really good things on corn, made some advancements, but there's a lot of room to improve our soybean yields. Over the last 9 years, we've built our APH up 9 bushels. It's a bushel per year. That's a pretty big trend to be building. And I've done it with 5 strategies. I won't discuss all of them, but I'll talk about the 2 that costed me nothing. Okay? I put the seed in deeper, and I planted it earlier. Collected more sunlight, and gave those plants a higher opportunity to build me more bushels. Okay? Those were the 2 number 1 success strategies. And so we think about that planting depth on beans. So when I look at this, I say, okay, this is confident. 2018 multi-location data says that the deeper one was the best. Now, 0.3 bushels isn't anything to really write home about, right? Not that good. But again, what are we seeing there? We're seeing a range. We're seeing a trend, 0.3, 0.9, and 0.3. That's that comfort zone that we can play in. Okay, it's going to the depths. We go too shallow, we start to lose a lot of bushels, a lot of potential. So back to this, a little bit of a video to play. Again, 2.5 on your right, 2 on your left. Yes, that's 2.5 and 2 on soybeans. I'm going to go into this dry spot in this dry pocket and do a little exploration. And what we found were there were 14 kernels to the north, 14 kernels to the south that didn't germinate. Okay, and we found a handful of them that were hard, viable, just waiting for that moisture to come. Planted at 2 inches, 15 days after planting, that seed is still viable. It's just waiting for the right amount of moisture. Right next to those 2 kernels, those 2 plants that grew, okay, right next to the 2 in the bottom left, those did not quite make it. So what is the right amount of moisture? All right, I want to help build a visual here, so I do ask for some audience participation, and I know since we have such a big audience, I'm going to probably volunteer somebody to help me. All right, but anyone willing to volunteer to help? Tim, this is at that point where everyone goes like this. Oh, no, don't look at Nate. He's going to call on me. He's going to call on me. Dan, you're looking down. All right, this is going to be real quick, guys. Dan, you take this. Take that jar. I'm going to plop that out. All right, Tim, you got this? All right. What I have in my hand are 15 sheets of ultra thick, quilted, Charmin toilet paper. Very expensive last year, decently priced this year, okay? And I've weighed these sheets and know that they're 0.4 pounds, okay? So think of this as a kernel. Think of this as a soybean kernel or a corn kernel. The right amount of moisture is not just getting it in wet, it's getting it to be a percentage. Corn, it's 30%, soybeans, 50%. We need 50% of the kernel weight of a soybean to imbibe to get that germination process started, to get it going, okay? So what I need you to do, Dan, is you're going to spray 40 squirts of water into that jar, okay? Tim, 10. As they're spraying, what we're simulating is the percentage of weight. Tim, with his 10 squirts, just put in 10% of the weight of this. Okay, our goal is to get to the line. Dan has 40%, okay? So Dan's 40%. Don't lose count now, Dan. It's very important that we stay right at 40, not 38, not 41. All right, so as you can see, a lot more water. as compared to a lot less water, all right? Before I get into... I think my jar is cracked on the bottom. No, I just spilled it. No. It's a good thing I got a backup. Here you go, Tim. Thank you for your help. Dan, thank you for your help. You want to keep these and keep yourselves cool, you're more than welcome to do that. All right. So I did spill some water. I'll get my backup. There's always a backup because earlier today I had two brothers, probably about 10 years old, and they thought they ought to get into a water fight instead of putting it into the jar. All right, so over here we have, from this morning, okay, our 40% weight, and from here, our 10%. Moral of the story is we're not getting enough to get up here, okay? At 40%, we got that line to start turning color and moving up. It's extremely important to put the seed into the moisture that we know, not putting it into a depth we've always done and hoping for that moisture to come after the fact, okay? And so the right planting depth may not be what we've always done, okay? It may not even be 1.5 inches, but we might have to put in that moisture that we know we need. All right, so when we go back another 15 days later, you can see we caught 3/4 of an inch, and yes, 3/4 of an inch was a very large measurable rain by me this year. Right, I'm at 5 inches of rain since our first planting date on August 1st. We've been catching some of these rains here. Last year was at 29 inches since August 1st, or from April 1st. Big spread, big difference. So you can see we have some gaps, we have some skips, but again, soybeans are important for what thing? When we get them emerged, we've talked about this for the last 1.5 years now. Soybeans operate on sunlight, corn operates on GDUs. How do we capture more sunlight with our soybeans? We plant them early. We get them in the ground, we get them growing, okay? The advantage that on our right has versus our left is significant. All right, but it never ceases to amaze me that when we have these, just enough moisture to get 2 to go, the 3 north were rotted, okay? Not enough moisture. It started that process, 40%, ran out, and then we had those that came after we got that 3/4 inch rain. 30% for corn, 50% on soybeans. Remember those numbers. When it comes to factor number 1, it's putting it into the right moisture. All right, so how do we get to the right moisture? What are some things that we can use today? There are technologies available. We have 2 displayed up here. Smart firmers. Smart firmers, as we plant, will capture data and information, moisture, temperature, organic matter, and the clean furrow. Okay, whether or not there's foreign matter in that trench, okay, optimizing seed to soil contact. And so when we think of moisture, this can help us make decisions on the fly. I'm not a betting man, okay, I'm not a gambler, but if I were, I'd be willing to bet that not one of you in this tent stop every 10 acres to check your planting depth. Am I correct? 10 acres? No? No? Hey, we made it through the entire field show presentation tour without one person stopping every 10 acres. How about once per field? Now we've got some head shaking, yeah. How about once at the beginning of the year and once next year when you take the planter back out of the shed? Okay, yeah, there we go. We got some head shaking there too. So I think it's important we make those decisions on the fly. Soil conditions can change from one end of the field to the next, right? They will change from field to field. They'll change from day to day. We actually could see that with our smart firmer, we were losing soil moisture throughout a day in central Illinois. All right, so if we have a smart firmer on the planter, that's better than nothing. It's giving us that information. But I'm not here to say you have to add any more than that, okay? Something we do on our PFR farm is we true up our planter. Truing up the planter is making sure that notch combination is the same from row to row to row, okay? It can be a lengthy process. For us on our 4-row planter, it's not so lengthy. But what we do is we take that 4x4 block on concrete, lay it underneath the gauge wheel, set the planter down, and then measure that gap between the disc and the concrete floor. And we do it every row because what we found is that on our planter 1, 2, and 3, it's the same hole combination to get me to 2 inches. But on row 4, I'm 1 whole notch different. Why is that? Huh? Tire track. That is the number one thing that we find is if it's in or off side of the tire track. I scouted a field last year where a grower was planting into LSW tires. So 1 row is right on that tire. no compaction, stand looked pretty good, but the planting depth was slightly off. I looked at his planter, it was wore out. The chatter from riding on that tread wore out the depth control on that planter faster than the other units. So when he thought he had that thing planting all at the same depth, one row was slightly off. On our 4-row research planter, one row was slightly off. So we make marks on there. White line indicates our 1.5-inch benchmark, yellow line our 2-inch benchmark. And what the smart firmer then tells us as we go through the field, we can look at it and see, okay, are we maintaining that 30% moisture, or should we be pushing that seed a little bit deeper to make sure we're there? Okay, precision tells us 30% soil moisture is where we want to try and achieve from their reading. Looking at this map in Central Illinois last year, our 2-inch planting depth, which we planted virtually the whole farm at, we were at 27 to 32% soil moisture. So we were pretty close. But guess what we should have done? We should have tried to achieve 32 to 38 to make sure that every kernel had 30% moisture. Extremely important. And it's important because we look at 30% versus 70%. Okay, I went to the extreme wet because too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing real quick. So I filled this cup. This isn't cookie or brownie batter. Okay, this is my soil from my farm. I'm very fortunate, blessed with 5.5% organic matter. But I planted 2.5 inch deep on both of them, 30% soil moisture versus 75% soil moisture. Today, we have mold growing on that kernel. Okay, too wet. We're rotting away. So this also prevents us from going what? Too deep. Okay? It helps us achieve that proper moisture. It's extremely important. So it's a quick change. We can look at that. We see some reds on the map. Now we know, hey, well, I got to go back there and change it. It's a quick change. We can just reference that line. Yeah, so on our 4-row, we're running 1. Their recommendation is 1 per 4 rows. If you're running this smart depth, then their recommendation is 1 per row, and they're using 4 smart depth firmers to control 1 motor, 1 depth control. Okay, and so it's more information to make one decision than it is the opposite way, which introduces me into smart depth, which we are hoping to take a look at. But that's what I got sitting right here. Okay, so this is smart depth. Smart depth takes the information from smart firmer and changes that depth on the fly, changes it on the go. So we can set a range. I can tell at the computer to say, I want to be at 2 to 2.5 inches, no shallower than 2, no deeper than 2.5, okay? And then I want to be above 30% moisture. And that will change the depth on the fly within that range to maintain that level, okay? So we're hoping to take a look at it because when we see back to this map, as we map even our 300-foot to 400-foot strips, look at the variability from top to bottom. Okay, it does change. There's a lot of variability there. So smart depth, it is a technology that we're excited about taking a look at, but smart firmers give us the information. All right, number 1, soil moisture. Put that seed into adequate moisture. Adequate moisture is the weight of the kernel. No, it is not going to be on PFR this year. We set up we set up one of our planters. I don't know which one we set up for sure, but we were having some complications with them, so we're reinstalling on and looking for future testing on them. Yep. Stay tuned is the best I can say. All right, so what else can these smart firmers tell us? Smart firmers also tell us temperature. Okay, so number 2 factor to consider is temperature. Those that know me know I've been recommending for years, throw that soil thermometer out or put it back on the grill where you found it. Okay, it's good for testing meat temperature, but not soil temperature. What we see when we see seedling injury or effects of cold, it's not because of what it imbibed, it's what happened after that process. Okay? It's what happened from that imbibing process to emergence. This is a temperature fluctuation. Got to a point where it was colder above than it was below, so the corn was going to go back down. And then it warmed back up and it's going to come back up. Okay? So temperature is still really important, but the key take home is placing that seed into consistent soil temperature. Okay? Consistent soil temperature is the key. We look back to this map, again, from north to south, top to bottom, we want that color to be all the same. So that's what's going to help us make that decision is where are we finding that consistent temperature. Here in Minnesota, where I'm on the PFR farm, my office is there. I've been operating it since 2017. We got a real good jump start on planting this year. Our first planting date was April 6th. On April 14th, we were blessed with snow, or our wheat farmers call it free nitrogen. Okay? Our wheat growers love when we get snow on top of that. Had the snowfall, we're able to get back in the field on April 22nd, put another planting date into it. On May 1st, we still had no emergence. Then I got nervous. I haven't been that nervous in a long time, but that seed was sitting in the ground for a very long time, okay? And I thought right away, oh no, I shouldn't have thrown my soil thermometer away. Maybe it was too cold. We knew that we were planting into about 48-degree soil temperature, but it was consistent. It didn't fluctuate, 48. We went a little deeper. And that's what saved us, because on May 5th, both planting dates emerged at the same time, at the same stand. That seed almost sat for a whole month in the soil, and then we got the temperature and things were off to the races. Today, this will be the highest yielding soybean and corn check in the plot. Again, okay, that early planting date outweighs the temperature as long as we're planting it into consistent temperature. It's the fluctuations that really hurt us, okay? That leads me into crop development, which I believe in the middle, stuck in the middle children are just as important as the oldest and the youngest. I'm a middle child, that's why I say that. But in the middle is crop development. Number 3, it's very important. And I say that because when we think of a soybean, okay, and a corn plant, there are some development things that need to take place in order for us to set up for optimal yield. On corn, nodal root development into the soil. Not above the soil, into the soil. Okay, number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 nodal roots need to be into the soil. Okay, all of our water is uptaken through our nodal roots for filling our grain. On a dry year like this, how important is having all of our root structures in the soil? And just a northern twang, when I say root, I mean root, okay? Tim was looking like, what's the root? What is a root, right? We have to get them in the soil. It's extremely important. When it's dry like this, these are the guys that are uptaking all of our water and nutrients to fill that grain. If we don't get number 5 into the soil, we just gave up 20% of our root mass potential. 20%. So we want to make sure we're in. On soybeans, it's not so much the structure of the root, it is where it is placed. Most of our nodulation process starts at the planting depth, okay? Slightly above that's where we get our lateral branches. Think of soil temperature. We talked on the cold side, but what about what we're feeling right now in this tent? The hot side. I've measured soil temperatures at a ½ inch in our soils as high as 105 degrees. How many of us today want to make 5 laps around this tent and then go to work the rest of the day? Okay, we get pretty lethargic. Biology do the same thing, especially those that the soybean builds that symbiotic relationship with. 72 degrees is optimal for nodulation process to take place. And so if we can get that seed down into the soil temperature that's more consistent and it stays cooler, we don't have those temperature fluctuations in that top inch, we see better structure, we see more nodulation, more active nodulation, okay? If you heard Jim speak earlier or this afternoon, you'll hear him say it's not so much the number of nodules, it's the activity that's taking place around them. That takes place in that little bit of cooler soil where it's more consistent. So planting depth on soybeans becomes extremely important in the development and setup for the yield potential. It's not just getting them up and out of the ground, it's what's to come throughout the season, okay? So crop development. 2 things, we'll hit on it. Just a quick story. This video is actually this plant here and this plant here. On your left, I pulled this from that row, and on your right, I pulled this from the row. We have a dealer who did a side-by-side planting depth study, just a showcase, okay? And I went out there and I took a look at it, and we saw that at the 2-inch planting depth, okay, we still had all the nodal roots in the ground, but yet we were not quite fully developed in there. At our 2.5 inch, okay, we had better root structure, more aggressive and vigorous roots, and this is what we see from a crop development standpoint. When we get those nodal roots set up for the right potential, we see it in a consistency of ear stand or ear placement as well as consistent ears. So we think of a planter, doesn't matter which one of these up here, we can spend up to $2,000-$3,000 per row, okay? And if we don't get the planting depth right, we may lose that picket fence look. So all this stuff is to help us get there, but where's that right depth, okay? So 2.5, 2. On soybeans, we have this one at 2 inches. Now, how do we check late season? This often gets me into trouble, all right? Dan, I'm going to have you help me with the corn one here. We can still find the planting depth today. I can go pull a corn plant from the show plot and tell you how deep it was planted. Okay, and it's by finding this right here. This mesocotyle, right there, that is where the seed once was. Actually, on that plant, there was still some purple seed treatment. The seed coat was still there, okay? And we just take that and measure it. I've marked where the soil depth was, and we are at, Dan, how deep are we at? See the line there for soil depth? 2.5. 2.5 inches, thank you. 2.5 inches, okay? So oftentimes, we'll go out and scout when there's an issue, and we'll see what was the planting depth. Did we hit it right? Did we miss it? And a guy said, I planted at 2 inches, Nate. We'll go look, and maybe it's not quite there, okay? There are things that happen after we'll talk about. Soybeans. Charles. We can still today tell where that plant or where that seed was placed. It's a little harder on soybeans, but we look for right here, this little hook, okay? Where that plant makes a little S-curve, that's about where that seed was. Not as accurate on corn, but it gets us within that 16th or 8th of an inch. So right here is where that hook was, okay? Here is my soil depth. I want you to tell me where that was at.
2 inches.
Right there, 2 inches, right? Thank you. 2 inches. Make sure you use that. Yes, sir. Ooh, I love crusting. We're going to get right into that next. The question was, if I put it in too deep and it crusts, will it come up? It's a great question. I'm going to table it for right now because it's coming up right next. All right, so we can still check what that planting depth was. All right, so I say this, crop development is the most important reason of why we want to make sure we have it 2 inches or deeper. This is still going to be good corn, okay? This is still going to be good corn. This is going to be better corn. It's important to find that right depth because of the development itself. Soil conditions, here we are. Crusting, what happens if I get a crust? I'm afraid to put it too deep because it might not come up. Ever since we put spike closing wheels on our research planters, we have not dealt with crusting issues. If we're using both of them, here's our Yetter poly twisters. It creates a pattern on top of the soil that even after our compounding rains allows for that soil to fracture between those patterns, opening that soil and allowing that crop to come up. We haven't had to run a rotary hoe, we haven't had to drag, we haven't had to run the planter back across the row to break that soil up. Before we did. So I say this, there are more factors that say we should be putting it in deeper and then considering what equipment we have on the planter to make sure that we don't have those crusting issues. Okay? There are hard pounding rains that come. If it's going to happen on my tight soils, if it's not going to happen here, it isn't going to happen anywhere else because we can compress and lose a lot of soil density with a rain, okay? So I don't touch a lot on soil conditions, but I do have some factors that I do think are important. If I throw the word digger out here, that means field cultivator. It's just a Minnesota thing, okay? So when we go out there and prep the seed bed with a field cultivator, some years we'll have a basket on there to make sure that we firm it, okay? 2 years ago, we were in some real wet conditions. We were up against the calendar. We were losing May pretty quick on planting date. So we took the baskets off the field cultivators, ran jags. The guys that didn't put them back on this year dealt with some pretty poor soil conditions. Really dry and fluffy, okay? Too fluffy, and then when we got that rain, we compressed the soil. So when we scouted after planting, we were at 2 inches, but really after that rain, we were only at about 1.5 inches. Okay, so post-planting considerations are important. So don't spend too much time on soil conditions because we all have different practices. We have different soils. We have different aggregation. We're taking a look this year at some no-till versus conventional till because we, and where I come from, it's heavy tillage. It's borderline recreational tillage, okay? But what we're starting to see is on our conventional tilled soil, which I have here, and our no-till soil, simulated a 1-inch rain on top of it, and this surprises me. Today, there's still water that hasn't permeated that soil, okay? Where over here, we had plenty of oxygen pores, plenty of space for that water to find its way through to get to the bottom of the jar. So this gets real tight and compressed. This soil right here is what crusts over and gives us a lot of headaches at the end of the season. So soil conditions can vary from field to field, year to year, farm to farm. But I want you to consider this when you leave here on soil conditions. Pre-scouting to find out what depth you're going to go to is important. But remember, if you have row cleaners, that you might move some soil away. So if we scout down 2 inches and say, well, we got good moisture, good temperature, that's where I'm going to place my seed, but then we run some row cleaners on there and we move away a 1/4 inch of soil, now our final planting depth might not be into those right conditions. So row cleaners move soil. And then closing systems. Closing wheels are here. I call this a closing system, okay, because we're actually compressing that sidewall. We're pulling that soil in, and then we're just firming it down. Okay, so it's kind of a 2-stage action. So that's why I say closing systems. Over here too, what we saw with our Yetter 2x2x2 was it was actually displacing some seed in different soil types. And so our planting depth from what we were scouting was not the same after this system went over it. This one here. This is a closing system, okay? And this is why aftermarket companies are making things like that. Okay, a 2-stage, pulling in that furrow, pressing it down. This makes me a little concerned on some of those tight clays because there's not enough of a pattern on top of that soil for the soil to fracture if we were to get some hard pounding rains. Well, that's why we're taking a look at this, because we're getting a pattern on top of that soil. I don't care what color planter it is. I really don't. I think every planter, there are attachments or settings that can make that thing just as good as the next. Tractors we'll have another conversation on. I'm kidding. All right, so final factor, number 5, post-planting considerations. I already discussed what might happen on the soil after, and this is the big one. Because in that side-by-side with that corn, the actual targeted depth was 3 inches on planting and 2.5, and we ended at 2.5 and 2. Okay, so this is our PFR farm since 2018. We managed the fertility really well on this. Okay, our tillage is more of a strategy. Okay, it's not a practice. So we're doing some different things based on what the conditions are in the fall. This is a new piece of ground we picked up this year. It's been 29 years of pretty aggressive tillage, what I would consider a stale seed bed. After simulating 1.5 inch rain, you can see how much that soil compressed. Okay, this has an effect on that final planting depth. So post-planting considerations, we have to think about what the conditions are now, what might happen, okay? And that's what we start thinking about in crusting. Well, it might crust. Well, what if we're not deep enough? What if we compress? Now my 5th nodal root is not going to develop into the soil. Now the majority of where my biological activity needs to take place is in that top inch where those temperatures are going to fluctuate and get pretty warm, okay? So getting it down a little deeper is a good strategy on how we can avoid these type concerns. I'll throw out there herbicide injury on our high organic matter soils. We do see less herbicide injury when we get that seed down a little deeper, okay? Just think about the plant structure. The shoots are just a little bit thicker. They're a little further developed along. They can handle some of that contact. And what I mean by that is some of the pre-emerges we're laying on top of the soil. If we don't get enough water to push it in, and we're trying to push through that, we can see some injury. So getting them a little deeper, we see less herbicide injury. And also, we got to consider what we're doing after. Rolling. We had a conversation this morning after about rolling. We run a land roller across, and it's not to push the rocks down so they don't get in the combine, okay? But it is to build a better harvestability. If we can keep that head flatter on that soil when we're cutting soybeans, we get more beans in. We've done that study in Practical Farm Research. We've shown that it gives us more yield, but it's not more beans per plant. It's just more beans are getting into the combine. That's how we gain more yield on that. But that does have an effect on what that final depth is. And then row crop cultivating, where we had those soybeans planted, we tried to go out there and hill those back up to see if we could compensate some of those temperature fluctuations, changing that final depth of where that planted depth was. All right. See some pens and papers out. My name's already wrote there, the phone number. Next year you'll call and say, you said, and then this happened. Okay. What's the final planting depth? Is it 1 inch? Is it 2 inch? Is it 3 inch? Hold that seed depth checker up, you guys. Okay. I don't know why we have 5 inches on there. I'll never recommend we plant down to 5 inches. But it's the code of an agronomist. That really depends. Okay? Huh? It could be. We just don't sell anything that I'd recommend at 5 inches. So, but it really does depend. But it depends upon these 5 factors. And these 5 factors that I want us all to consider. My hope is that we have the right conditions where that seed doesn't have to be any deeper than 2 inches and doesn't have to be any deeper than 1.5 inches, right? That's what the data says. It's extremely strong. It's extremely consistent. But those years when we have to think about things a little different, might have to consider going a little bit deeper, okay? 5 considerations: moisture, temperature, crop development, soil conditions, and post-planting considerations. All right, PFR is word. It's really good, but it's not the word, okay? When I'm out scouting fields, when I'm building presentations, Bible verses tend to come to mind. And when I was building this presentation a couple months ago, 2 Timothy 1:7 came to mind because of the swimming pool, okay? When I had that fear as a child, that fear was not instilled in my spirit, okay? The Lord tells us He did not give us a spirit of fear. Fear was developed through the eyes that I see and the ears that I have, probably from my buddies saying, hey, if you end up at the bottom of that 12 feet water, you ain't coming back up, okay? That develops fear, but it's of the world. It's of our surroundings. He tells us rather, though, He gives us a spirit of power, love, and of a sound mind. The experience in this tent will always outweigh any degree or agronomic knowledge information I have. My job is to help provide the factors so that you guys can build these placements and you can make these decisions more confidently. You can do it with power and you can do it with of a sound mind. So with that, I hope that we consider these 5 things, changing the decision from an emotional, where I've always planted, okay, to one that's of facts and information that you can be bold with, okay? So be bold, be confident in what you guys are doing and the decisions you make. Thank you so much for your support of Beck's. Thank you for attending today. We really are honored. I'm personally honored that you guys chose this time frame to listen and learn. And with that, enjoy the remainder of the day. Stay cool. There are waters in the coolers in the back. Be sure to grab one on your way out. Thank you so much.
Today, what I want to share with you is a little information that I've researched here to not only increase yield on low producing acres, but also increase our ROI. Because there's no reason some of our most variable acres, some of our toughest farm acres, that they can't be profitable as well. And my thought for this talk came after doing a little bit of research on national corn yield. And as we know, over the last 4 or 5 years, our national corn yield has been somewhere between about 170 and 175, give or take a bushel or two. And they put out this beautiful map, the USDA does, and they color code counties based on their county average. And I got to looking at this, and I quickly realized that there's only 2 colors on this map, dark green and slightly lighter dark green, that are above the national average. So anything that's in the lightest 4 colors on that map, those counties have a yield average that's below the national average. So I started thinking about those acres, and I dug a little bit deeper, and I found out that about 60 to 65% of the counties on this map fall in that category as below the national average in yield. And I thought, man, our marketing area is right in the center of all those light-colored stuff. So we need to start focusing on and educating on ways to increase yield across those acres and increase ROI across those acres, because that encompasses a lot of acres. And everybody in here probably has some of those acres on their farm, or maybe it's all of them. I don't know. But If you think about your hardest to farm acres, the things that are lowest producing, somebody shout out what a limiting factor on those acres is. What causes that yield to be lower? Anybody? Moisture. That's right. I like to call it saturated hydraulic conductivity. Yeah, exactly. I just put it up there so you guys think I'm smart and then you might listen more. But anyways, saturated hydraulic conductivity is basically water movement within the soil. The way the physical properties and gravity act upon the soil to make water move differently. So that influences how you retain water, how you infiltrate water, how you get water to move through the soil, or in some cases of tight clays, how you don't get water to move through those soils. And that's influenced by two types of soil properties. Those are inherent soil properties and dynamic soil properties. Now, on the left, your inherent soil properties are things you're not going to be able to change in your farming career. And if you do change them, it's typically because something catastrophic happened, a flood, huge dust bowl, windstorms, things like that. Those properties are gained by how the soil was formed and what the parent material in those situations are. Dynamic soil properties, those are things that we can influence. Things like soil depth, soil aggregate size, soil structure, organic matter. How you manage your soils is going to influence your dynamic soil properties, and that's going to influence the two main things I'm going to talk about today: water movement in the soil and nutrient movement and mobility and availability in the soil. So those are going to be the two main topics. So let's talk about some of these soils and how they differ. When I talk about lower producing acres, two things come to mind right off the top of my head: sand and clay, tight clays, and they're vastly different. The first one we'll look at is sand. Those are your single grain soil soil structure. A lot of times your single grain structures are low in CECs, meaning they have low nutrient holding availability, they have lower number of exchange sites, they have more pore space that contains air, and water moves through them rapidly. I'll show you an example of sand here that I brought with me, and you'll get some of that. These sands usually don't get compacted, but they don't have a lot of structure to them. So if I try and hold up a handful of sand, is there going to be any structure to it? No, it just falls out. You can see all the single grains on my hand there. Those low CEC soils like this one has a CEC of 4. Okay? To give you a ballpark of how low of nutrient holding capability that has, a rough estimate of how much nitrogen you can hold per CEC point is 10 pounds per CEC point. So any given time in any given situation, that soil right there can only hold about 40 pounds of nitrogen. If we're trying to grow 130, 150, 170 bushel corn crop, is 40 units of nitrogen going to be enough? Probably not. We got to think about how we manage in those situations. The second one's a little different. That's our clays. I got some clay here. We're probably all familiar with that. But it falls into what they call a platey soil structure. And they call it that because it resembles like a stack of plates or like the shuffling of a deck of cards. There's layers that go in there and overlap. And to get water to move through those, it physically has to go around those plates. And to get nutrients to move in those, it physically has to move around those plates. When these soils like clay, this has a lot different structure, right? I can hold it here, you can look at it, it just doesn't fall to the ground. If I break it open, you can see how these plates go together, kind of like a Tetris or a puzzle piece there, okay? As these kind of soils shrink and swell, I did that backwards. As they swell and shrink, you can actually physically trap nutrients in between the layers. Potassium is one, for example, that gets stuck in there. Now, in these soils, because they're so tight, water doesn't move through them. That's where we get our ponding. That's where we get our surface runoff, things like that, that move our nutrients away from where we want them in the plant. Everybody's favorite is going to be granular. That's your loams. Those are your dark soils, typically high in organic matter, okay? This is a really good loam right here. I put about 8 ounces of water into this on Tuesday afternoon, and then it's set out here in the 90, 100 degree heat over there behind that stand since then, okay? The water holding capacity on loams, because of their high organic matter and granular structure, is extremely high. So I put 8 ounces of water in here on Tuesday, and I can take this soil right here, I can still make it into a mud ball. That's how good a nutrient holding and water holding capacities these kind of soils have. So we're maximizing the minimum in this talk. I'm not going to touch much on those, but the final one I will touch on is our massive soil structures down here in the lower right-hand corner. We get massive soil structure a lot of times when we mismanage a different soil structure, specifically clays. If you get on those soils when they're wet and compact them, you turn into a massive soil structure where it takes all that platey structure and it smashes it into a brick. Water does not move through those. Nutrients don't move in them. Root growth is restricted. And ultimately, the bottom line is that you're in trouble if you got these situations, okay? So that's just a little bit of dynamic properties that can affect your soil structure. Now, along with the water movement I talked about earlier, let's think about how water gets into a corn plant. Water gets into the corn plant, obviously, from the roots. And when you look at the architecture of a set of roots on a corn plant, the majority of those roots, 80% of that root mass is within 7 inches of that plant. That's 7 inches wide, 7 inches deep, all directions 7 inches, okay? And where you get your water from and your nutrients, 40% of it is in the top quarter of that root mass. 30% of it's in the second quarter of that root mass, 20% of it third quarter, 10% fourth quarter. So the majority of your root mass within 7 inches of that plant is getting 70% of its nutrients from the top half of that root mass. That is extremely important when we look at the different management styles, different product selections, when we talk about managing on variable acres. Okay, so we will get into product selection here. The first thing I want to talk about on product selection is we're naturally increasing our yield through product selection. This graph here shows genetic gains from 1866 all the way up to 2020. And basically, if you take all those yield increases over time, boil it down, it's somewhere right near 2 bushel per acre per year we're getting. So we're increasing our yield naturally through genetic selection, as well as understanding our soils better, fine-tuning our management practices, fertility practices, things like that. But one thing I want you to think about on product selection is something we honestly don't think about enough. We talk about standability, we talk about emergence, we talk about disease scores, all those other things, ear flex, when we're talking about product selection for our acres, but we never talk about the root architecture. And that's what I want to touch on now. If you boil corn hybrid roots down to 3 architectures, you can boil them down to balanced, vertical, and flat root architectures. The pictures there do a pretty decent job, but I brought some just for fun. First thing I'm going to talk about is a flat root architecture. You can see versus a vertical root architecture, they go out at a wider angle, more spread out, so our distance away from the stalk horizontally is wider, and they don't have as much penetration depth to them usually. The vertical, on the other hand, very acute angle coming away from the plant. They got more depth, more of it's focused on rooting deeper. Now, when I look at tough to farm acres, one thing I talk about with root architecture is where we place them. So we'll start off with our sands. When we talk about moisture and nutrients in sand or coarse-grained soils, nutrients typically move down in those soils. They don't have nutrients and water. They don't have enough exchange sites, organic matter, to hold on to them, so they physically leach through the soil down. That's where you see an advantage from the vertical root architecture. You get deeper rooting depth, you get more concentration of roots in that vertical band, and so you have more ability to keep those roots in an environment that is nutrient rich and moist for longer. Now, on the opposite hand, we talk about our flat root architecture. I like to use these on our heavily saturated clays, things that don't drain water very well. The reason for that is you can see there's more in the upper quarter of this root mass than that one had. There's more roots there. They span out wider. Well, if we think about clays and nutrient movements, it's very hard to get nutrients to move through clays. So in our nutrient-rich environment, which is generally the upper 3 to 4 inches of our soil profile, because that's where we do our spreading of fertilizer, that's where the highest organic matter is, we want the most of our roots there. The other thing has to do with oxygen in the soil. When we saturate a soil, we remove the oxygen from it. When you remove oxygen, all things in that soil, they stop. I mean, if I took the oxygen out of this tent right now, it wouldn't be very long before we'd start figuring out something to do to make ourselves breathe again. Your soil microbes are going to do the same thing. Your roots are going to do the same thing. So if we can get those clays to dry out from the top and the majority of our root mass is in there, we'll see a little bit of success off of that. There's some research out there that shows that root architecture can have as much as a 5% influence on yield in those saturated and sandy conditions. So in the sandy conditions, we can see a vertical root architecture have about 5% yield increase over any other type, and the same thing on the clays with the flat root architecture. So although it's not one of my number one things I look at, be aware of what the root architecture is. I have pictures of every hybrid in these lineups and what the root architecture is and all the other scores on them, so that information is available if you need it. The other thing I want to talk about is how we test for this stuff. Now, a lot of times when we talk about PFR studies or you hear the seed industry talk about testing, you see test plots that have all these gigantic yields, 260, 270, 280, and they're all promoting that stuff. And I agree with that, right? On the flat and black acre, we need high yield and we need it to stand and just let it rip. But what about all these other acres? What about those 65% of counties that have below national average yield? And so we took that into heavy consideration, and that's how we line up our choice trial testing. So our replicated hybrid advancement trials, our choice trials that are spread across all the U.S., we break them down by the NCCPI, National Crop Commodity Production Index. Okay, so basically the higher the number, the better your soil. Our low-producing choice trials where we do genetic advancement and product selection, there's 46 of them across the U.S. that are on NCCPI below 62. 43 that are on medium productivity soils, 63 to 79, and then the rest are on high productive soils. Okay, so here's that map again. Take a snapshot of where some of those lower producing lighter green color soils are, and then we'll overlay our medium productivity map right on top of that. So if we flip back, low productivity areas, our map medium productivity areas, our map pretty much replicates that. Average NCCPI of 71. So if you're trying to correlate yield to that, think somewhere in that 170 to 220. Okay, that's generally what these trials are going to be averaging in, and that's where we're testing. These are our low productivity trials. And you can see them, they're spread southern Illinois, southern Indiana, Missouri, and Kansas. If you see a green dot, that means it's irrigated. There was a trial out in central Kansas last year that was a replicated trial that averaged 65 bushel to the acre. We're testing our products in those environments because that's real world stuff out there. Okay? These have an average NCCPI of 46. That's pretty rough stuff. Okay? And we're testing there. So pay attention to the traits that we have, the products that we have, and the root structure to help you make the best decision for these low-end acres, because product selection is a huge key to success there. Now, the next thing is nutrient management. This is one of the toughest things on both our sands and our saturated soils. What you see on the screen is the illustrations of Liebig's law of the minimum. So you got the barrel staves there, and obviously the shortest stave on the barrel is going to let the water out of the barrel. And it's the same thing in crop production. Liebig's law states that your yield is not determined from the total amount of nutrients you throw at a corn crop. It's limited by the lowest available nutrient that you have. So it doesn't matter how much nitrogen, how much potassium, how much phosphorus you have out there. If your sulfur is way low, that's going to be your yield limiting factor. Or in this example, the potassium's way low, so that's a yield limiting factor. So as you've probably heard before somewhere today, that we need all this stuff in balance. We need our soil fertility in balance. We need fertility available to the plant and in the plant in balance, or you'll start to see yield limiting factors come out. Two of the things that I think are most important on these lower producing acres is nitrogen, and one that doesn't get the credit it deserves a lot of time, and I think it's boron, okay? There's more important things than boron, but boron we haven't really focused on, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So nitrogen. One of the things that was said earlier was moisture is one of our limiting factors. And moisture, pH, temperature, organic matter, that all influences nitrogen. So let's look at how nitrogen is used in the plant and when it's used. Think about that sand for a second, okay? It has the ability to hold 40 units of nitrogen at any given time. Our corn plant hasn't used 40 units of nitrogen up until about it gets to the V8, V10 growth stage, okay? So then after that, you see a rapid uptake, and we're talking about 7 to 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day is coming from the soil into those plants. Now, my sands only hold 40 pounds of nitrogen. They can hold a little more than that, but it's really susceptible to loss. So when we're taking up 7 to 10 pounds of nitrogen per day, my soil can only hold 40. I need to think about a management practice that allows me to either spoon feed or split apply that nitrogen later in the season. But at the same time, I still need about 20 to 25% of my nitrogen post-pollination to help grain fill and stuff. So management practices is huge on that. Now, when I talk about that sand only holding 40 units of nitrogen at a time, I want to talk a little bit about why this is important. So, no matter what form of nitrogen that you apply to your soil, it could be urea, it could be anhydrous, it could be AMS, it could be UAN, it could be ammonium sulfate, it could be ammonium nitrate, whatever it is, it enters the soil, goes through a couple transformation processes depending on the source, and it generally always ends up in the nitrate form. The nitrate form of nitrogen is negatively charged, just like your soil particles, so they do not attract. It's free in the soil. On our sands, the reason it can't hold them is because it's exposed to leaching. So downward movement of nutrients or water through the soil, nitrogen loss on your sands is almost 100% due to leaching. Different situation on our poorly drained soils. When we talk about our poorly drained soils, we start talking about a process called denitrification. Now, I talked about those microbes earlier, right? They need oxygen. If we put our soils in a situation that they get saturated and there's no oxygen, those microbes that are doing a lot of great biological processes in the soil will attack that nitrate nitrogen, use the oxygen to survive, and then you have nitrogen gas. And nitrogen gas goes this way, up and out. So that's how we lose it on our clays. So even though those clays have a high CEC, that specific one has a CEC of 36, so theoretically can hold 360 pounds of nitrogen at any given time, we still don't want to do that because if we get saturated and we have to rely, or our microbes have to rely on that nitrogen to survive, we're going to lose a pretty good percentage of that. And that percentage gets higher as temperature gets warmer later in the season. Now, this is kind of what I just described, the whole time versus error thing. So think about this as a growing season. The left is planting, the right is harvest. If you apply all your nitrogen, pre-plant or with the planter early in the season, every day that you go longer, you increase your opportunity for loss of nitrogen in that, okay? So if we want to reduce that margin of error, one of the greatest things we can do is push that timetable out to when the plant is actually needing the nitrogen and using the nitrogen so we're not exposing it to loss. And that's illustrated there. If you run the same plane, the same angle out, your margin of error gets reduced just by putting a time coefficient in there to a time when your plants need it, when your soil can hold it, and then you're not going to be as exposed to loss. The other thing you gain in that time period there is information. You gain knowledge. You know what the weather is going to do, it has been doing. If you're potentially losing nitrogen, if you're in a great growing condition and you're mineralizing nitrogen, you may not need to add as much. So one of the keys to nitrogen management on lower producing acres, I always recommend the split shot application. That can be some up front, that can be some with the planter, maybe some at side dress, maybe you can wide drop. Any of those options to get nitrogen out later into the season, have it available when the plant needs it, is going to be a success. The other thing is a little bit of placement. We're going to do a little placement lesson here. This is results from a study we did here at PFR where we planted the corn, 30-inch rows, that's illustrated on the screen, And we came back and we side dressed anhydrous right down the middle of the row. So 15 inches away from the plant on either side. Then we went through and we soil tested 8 weeks after application to see how much nitrate was there, how much ammonium was there, and where the physical placement of it was in the soil. So they sampled in the corn row and then every 3 inches across it till in the next corn row to see where that was. And you can see at the graph, the highest concentration of nitrogen is right down the middle of the row, right where we put it. Okay? If you remember back to one of my opening comments, it was 80% of the corn roots are within 7 inches of the plant. This graph here depicts that the majority of our nitrogen, 8 weeks after application, is still greater than 9 inches away from the plant. So we're asking a little portion of our roots to do a lot of grabbing of nitrogen. And that's just not realistic sometimes. So we can probably, especially on tight clays, those poorly drained soils, if we can place that nitrogen closer to the plant via a Y drop application or with the planter, you're going to see some successes in those situations. PFR Proven corn strategies. These are things I already touched on. Split shot nitrogen there on the bottom. You can see our yield advantage and our ROI by just split shotting our nitrogen. That's 30 units with the planter, come back at V3 and side dress 160 units versus all 100% up front. Now, if you go around to these PFR sites, you look at them, they're pretty flat, they're pretty decent soils, they're not exposed to a whole bunch of loss from runoff. On your tougher to farm soils, things with terrain, poorly drained soils, or even sands that can't hold it, I would bet, and I would bet a lot, that your ROI would be higher than what we see here on the PFR farms. The thing too with this $72.36, that was based on corn that's about $2 under the market price right now. So you take that 19 bushel advantage that we got from side dress and you multiply it by the price of corn that you're selling for today or that you're going to sell it for, that's your real world number right now. The other thing I like on these tough acres is planter applied fertility. The top PFR proven, our PFR success strategy number 3 is nitrogen applied on both sides of the row with the planter. Up to 60 units. We've seen really, really good ROI on those. So I like those systems. I like being able to spoon feed nitrogen to the plant early in the season, just a little bit, because I already told you it's not used much till V6, V7. But it also opens up the opportunity to apply other different fertilizer products at the same time. So on our clays, on our tight soils, I like fertilizer products with the planter that are high in phosphorus. Phosphorus is not readily available in tight, saturated soils early in the season. Number 1, because they're cold. Number 2, because they're wet. So if we can have some planter applied fertility there to get that plant off and growing, get better root elongation, more girth to the stalk, we'll set ourselves up with a better stand to go throughout the season. Now on our sands, I like nitrogen and I like sulfur. 2x2 or 2x2x2 with the planter. We see some very good development things. We tend to see more kernel rows around in those situations where the plant has sulfur and nitrogen early in the season. And some hybrids are very, very sensitive to that. So we want early season establishment, early season growth there because that sets the stage for what's going to happen the rest of the growing season. These are a couple PFR proven in-furrow products. One thing I will say, these can be run 2x2. These are 2 products that I like on those clay-based soils when they're tight, when they're saturated, when we don't get a whole lot of warming in no-till situations. I like these products here. You can see the analysis at the bottom. Both have a really good amount of phosphorus in them. They got a low salt load. They're low in nitrogen. They're low in potassium, so they're relatively safe. We tested these in furrow, but you could see very good responses from testing or doing them 2x2. All right, boron. If you're sleeping, wake up. This is all I want you to do. If you're going to try one thing on your farm next year, if you're going to try one thing on these lower producing acres, I would encourage you to apply a boron product at some time during the growing season, particularly later in the growing season, okay? Look at the uptake curve of boron. A little bit different than that we saw of nitrogen. There are 2 rapid uptake points in boron throughout the season. The first one you see is about V10, and it goes all the way up to R1. The plant takes up boron in those situations because boron has a high use in pollen viability, the amount of pollen, silk tube elongation, and kernel tip fill and kernel retention. Okay, so it's taking it up there in order to get ready for pollination. The other one you see is about R2 to R4. Boron's responsible in the plant for helping build those pathways, which remobilize nutrients from the green tissue, the stalk, the leaves, and pack it into the ear for ear weights, as well as kernel retention. So, although boron doesn't get the credit it deserves, I think it's the next step after we get our NPK and sulfur figured out. And the great thing about boron is it's cheap. A lot of times these boron products, these 10% boron products, are $4 to $5 to $6. And because of the timing of it, rapid uptake around R2, we can apply it with our fungicides at VT and see a really good response. Boron's very mobile in the soil, so each year you have to rely on your mineralization of organic matter to get your boron you need. If you're in low organic matter situations, or if your soils are saturated and not mineralizing effectively, you're going to be short on boron. Okay? The best way to tell if you're short on boron is look at your tip fill. If you see a lot of pollination and you see it tipping back hard after that, unless you're in severe drought or moisture stress, you probably have a lack of boron, and you can tissue test for that. Couple products here, Boron Plus, Feast XL, Profit Master. They're 2 we've tested in PFR. Got the PFR Proven badge. $7.5 an acre return on investment there. And the great thing about this, if you're making that fungicide trip already, I'd say throw it in, $4, $5, $6 an acre. Get your $7 an acre back on top of your product cost. You're doing all right for a trip you're already going to make there. I love looking at boron, and I think it's something everybody should at least try if you're making that fungicide pass. If you're not making a fungicide pass, there are a few other options, and if you got questions on that, you can get with me afterwards. The final thing is fungicides. Now, I want you to think about this a little differently, because I said at the beginning of this, I not only want to increase your yield, but I want to increase your ROI. And when we talk about some of these 120, 30, 40, 50, whatever your low limit yield is, and then I'm going to ask you to go out there and spend 20 to 30 bucks on a fungicide, and you're going to look at me like I'm crazy. But I got some data here that's going to show that there is some advantages to this situation, and there's some silent science behind it. So fungicides do a number of different things. Obviously, they suppress diseases, fungal diseases. That's what they're named for. But the other thing that they do, and they do it very efficiently, is they suppress a hormone in the plant called ethylene. And when ethylene is expressed in the plant, it triggers that plant to start ripening. The corn plant out there, those corn plants, they don't care what you want it to do. All they want to do is reproduce and make at least one kernel to survive on to the next year and the next year and the next year. They don't care that you want maximum yield, okay? So if we can suppress that ethylene, keep that plant from ripening earlier in the season or shortening that grain fill period, you're going to see an increase in your yield. You're going to see an increase in your standability. You're going to see an increase in your plant health overall. Here's a great example. Fungicide on the right, no fungicide on the left. That picture is taken about 3 weeks after the application of that fungicide, and you can already see these plants start senescing. So that's just a very good visual. Here's a real-world example. This is a test plot we have in northern Illinois. Doing a couple different management practices across it. We flew it with the drone with the NDVI map. Anybody guess what that strip right through the middle that's red and yellow is? We missed the fungicide. We did not run fungicide on that strip there. Right now, if you go out and look at that, I would guess there's probably going to be a 20 bushel yield disadvantage in that fungicide strip. The plants are already senescing. The stalks are not as rigid. They're not as tough. We don't have as much kernel depth there. Okay? And this is in the absence of disease. That field was clean as a whistle when we did that fungicide application. Field from a year or two ago, This is in northern Illinois, 174 bushel on the right, 154 on the left. Now, in some situations, you guys may say, hey, that's pretty good yield. This particular area, this township here, is about 75 to 100 bushel behind the rest of the county. Okay? High producing area. This draw through here, you get some poorly drained on the south end. Obviously, you're around some timber, and you get some sand veins on the north end. It's a tough, tough farm for that area. The data represented on the top comes from the black X checkered area on the map. Okay? The only difference in management practices here was on the right, you had fungicide applied in that black check area. On the left, you had no fungicide applied in that black check area. Data on the top from the yield monitor shows you 20 bushel to acre difference. That's pretty awesome. What I thought was more awesome was the corn on the right, the higher yielding corn, was 2 points drier. When you give the plant the ability to naturally dry down, go through its natural process without dying down, you will have drier grain. Now, 14 to 16, that's not earth-shattering. But as you increase harvest moisture, that variant increases. So when we get up to 24, 25% corn we're harvesting, I can guarantee you that'd be a 4 to 5 point spread on where we didn't have a fungicide. So in those northern climates where we get out early, we pick corn early, dry it down, that spread is a lot greater in those environments. All right, so we'll send it on home here. Here's a few fungicide products that we've seen at PFR really work. There's more in the PFR book. They're online. They're PFR proven. Why I like these fungicides is threefold. They have multiple modes of action. They have newer modes of action in them, and they all show a positive yield response and ROI. The ones I tend to gravitate to, especially on lower producing acres, are the strobilurins and the SDHI components. Okay, TrivaPro is one that has that, Muravis, there's others on the market that have that. Those two fungicide mode of actions are responsible for plant health, plant greening, and suppression of ethylene. The Trizol class is not going to give you any of that. Those other two, the SDHI and the strobilurins, are. So, thank you all for coming. I went a little bit long here today, but I'll wrap it up. I like fungicides on low producing acres. If you're going to have a crop out there and you want to boost it a little bit, make your grain a little bit drier, higher yields, higher test weights, fungicides are for you. Don't forget your boron. If you're going to make that fungicide pass, throw that boron in there. It's a cheap investment, and we've seen pretty decent results from that investment. Understand why your soils are low producing. Why is the water moving where it's moving? Is it the soil structure, or is it the management practice that you're doing that's affecting that? Okay? And then nitrogen. Split shot nitrogen is something I always recommend on these tougher to farm acres. It just makes sense when you're that exposed to loss. When I think nitrogen loss, I think throwing money in the trash can. So again, thank you all for coming. I hope you're enjoying your day. And if you have any questions, I will be up here for a little while afterwards. Thank you.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Things are flying with the wind. I'm going to keep that breeze going, though, because it's hot. Well, my name's Steve Galk. I'm the Regional Agronomy Manager for Beck's Hybrids. And actually, I'm working my 18th field show here this year. So, be with 19 years this fall with Beck's. It's been a fun ride. I've been a seed advisor and the agronomy role, and now I'm this Regional Agronomy Manager. So, it's been exciting, right, to watch the show grow, and many of you have been here for all those changes, and we appreciate you coming back and being a part of it year after year. So here we're going to talk a little bit about soil test and soil testing, and ultimately what I want to look at is what are the trends that are happening across the Midwest in soil testing. And so we think about soil testing in general, and I think about a house. Okay, when you go to build a house, do you start with a roof? Well, no, of course not, right? Do you start with the walls? No. That's what people see, but you start with the foundation. And now when I think about soil testing and raising a crop, I think of the same way. We start with the foundation. That's why I love this quote, right? Despite all of our accomplishments, we owe our existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. Or for some of us, the fact that it's not raining, right? Over time. But that's the foundation. So we've got to have a strong foundation, and soil tests help us do that. But as yields have been increasing, and as you guys have been doing a better job of raising crops, soil tests have started to change. Some of it through our practices, some through others, which we'll touch on. But I want to know if you're paying attention to what is actually limiting your yield potential. Could it be in your soils? So we start here, and we talk about the law of the minimum. Many of you have seen this barrel, right? And you think of a wooden barrel with wooden staves, and it'll hold as much water up to the shortest stave, right? So I think about nutrients, we think about it that way. Most of us think about N, P, and K, right, as our most important nutrients. So those staves on that barrel are always high. But what's the shortest one? Can we fix it? Do you know what that is on your farm? If we fix it, what's the next one? I use the example of pattern of tiling. We think about a field, and I've seen this happen, right? You got this field that's wet. So you're like, well, I don't have enough money to pattern tile. So I'm going to run a tile over here to this wet hole and drain it. Well, you do that, what happens? The wet hole moves over here, right? I'll run a tile over there, and I fix that. And now the wet hole's over here. And by the time you're done, you should have just pattern tiled it, right? So we're chasing that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that here with soil tests, right? We're chasing a moving target, but I want you to see what trends are coming. Maybe we can get ahead of that target, just like we would have if we would have pattern tiled. Then we're also going to talk about PFR studies and PFR Proven. Are PFR Proven products following the trend of soil test? There's some interesting correlations with what we're doing, what we see in PFR, and what we see as a trend through the Midwest in soil testing. So here's where we're going to start. You're going to see a lot of charts that look like this. These are from A&L Great Lakes Labs out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Now this is all their soil tests put together for each year. We go back to 1996 all the way to 2020. The blue bars show the average soil test for that year. The black dotted line shows us, it's our trend line, right? We see this is going up. The blue line will show us soils that are low or deficient in a nutrient. Now I start here with pH, because to me, I think pH is one of the most important things you're going to look at on your soil test. It is your starting point. Why is that? Well, pH does a lot of things for us, right? Herbicide tie-up, nutrients tie-up, what nutrients are available. There's a lot of things that pH affects. And I'm going to go into that in a second. But I want to take a look at that and look at this pH chart. And what's it doing? What's pH doing? It's going up, right? pH is going up. So why is pH going up? It's because you guys are doing a better job liming your fields, right? Some of you. How many of you feel like you're putting on more lime now than you ever have? Some, right? Okay. So that might be part of it. But I also like to quote Ronald Reagan, right? He said the most dangerous words in the English language are, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. So we go back to the Clean Air Act. We think about what came out of the Clean Air Act. Sulfur, right? We lost the sulfur in our atmosphere. Well, what was the pH of rainfall back in the 80s? 4.5, 4 to 4.5. That's right. What did we call it? Acid rain. See, I just thought my 87 Chevy wasn't built very well, right? But no, the acid rain caused it to rust. What do you think the average pH of rainwater is now? About 6.5. That's right. 6.5. Some people are telling me 7 in areas. Some people say 6. Okay, there's a range there, but what that tells me is the pH of rainwater has gone up. What you feed your soils are what they become. So as you feed them with rainwater that's higher in pH, we're naturally doing that. So, yeah, we're liming more, but as this pH goes up, we're actually going to lime less because we're going to look at our pH and go, oh, it's good, why do I need to lime? That concerns me, okay, from a calcium standpoint. So why else is pH important? I like this chart. I like to use this chart because the green shows when nutrients are highly available in the soil. The yellow is kind of a caution, right? We're struggling to get them out of the soil. And the red, we're in trouble, right? I can't get those nutrients. So if I look at phosphorus, and I come down here at 6.5, and I get lower than a pH of 6.5, I'm starting to tie up phosphorus in the soil. If I get to 6, I can put a lot of phosphorus on that farm, and my plants can't utilize it because of the pH being off. Corn likes pH about 6.3 to 6.7. Soybeans like it about 6.5 to 6.8. Okay? So as this pH is changing because of the rainfall, what nutrients we have available is also changing. So let's look at this, calcium. And I kind of threw calcium in here second because it correlates so closely with pH. The trend line on it is slightly down. The deficient soils hasn't changed much. But if your pH of your soils keeps going up, why would you ever put any lime on? You're not. What's lime have? Calcium. Why is calcium important, right? Soil structure. It binds to a lot of things, releases nutrients. So calcium is extremely important. If we don't stay ahead of this, I get concerned. Now, a lot of people look at base saturation and go, well, Steve, I'm going to watch my base saturation. I'll be fine. Well, base saturation, right, above 3% on K, 12 to 15% on Meg, 75% on calcium, that's kind of the range you want to be in. And some agronomists will say that's the end-all, be-all. Well, what that does is tell you how well your soils are balanced. But I could have a perfect base saturation on calcium and actually be low on calcium in the soil. Right? If all three are low, they're all imbalanced, or just imbalanced low, not high. So we got to keep an eye on calcium. That's one of the trends that isn't affecting us today, but I think could. Well, let's look at PFR and say, well, is it working in PFR? So here you go, 2x2x2. So you see all these, fancy planters up here and all that, and we kind of talk about all these kind of trinkets and things that go on them, and they're important, and they offer some opportunities. The 2x2x2 system offers us the opportunity now to start putting more nutrients on with the planter in higher rates, but yet being safe to the crop. So calcium's one of them. You see we're putting a half gallon into a gallon. We saw a yield response. Now, only one of them was profitable, but we saw a yield response. So that tells me there's something to this calcium staying flat to slightly down on the soil test trends that we do need some calcium. So think about this. I got two fields of lime. One's going to corn, one's going to soybeans. I can only afford to put lime on one of them. Which one should I do? The one going to soybeans. Soybeans have a higher reaction to calcium. You want to work on raising higher yielding soybeans? Calcium in the program will definitely help. So this study was obviously done on corn, but something else we're looking at in PFR, calcium on soybeans. So the trend, right? Calcium's going down. Let's move forward. Phosphorus. Look at that. So yields keep going this way, right? But our soil tests are going this way. Some point we're going to run into a problem, aren't we? So phosphorus is going down. Look at the percent of deficient soils. Look at it climb over the last few years. 25% of the soil tests they get in are deficient. Now, most of you probably aren't applying less phosphorus, right? But yet we're raising higher yielding crops. So are we offsetting for that? So we jump in here and I look at PFR studies again. 2x2x2 system again. I bring that up because it offers us an opportunity to precisely place the phosphorus where we need it. That to me is the real advantage of this system, right? Yes, I want to keep soil tests at a good level, but there's going to be some cost factors that come into the future, right? Of what can I afford to do? But if I can be more precise with my placement, be more efficient with it, I start to see more profitability, right? I'm over $26 from profit of adding some phosphorus to my starter. Why is it so important at the beginning of the season to have that phosphorus? Well, phosphorus is extremely important in establishing a grass. So if you're going to seed a yard, right, your new yard, phosphorus is an important fertilizer to have, important nutrient to have there. So on corn, it's a grass. So that's why we see a reaction out of phosphorus in the starter. So now I'm going to jump to potassium. Okay, so potassium also on a little bit of a downward movement. Now, potassium levels are hard to change in the soil, right? There's a lot of potassium there. It's hard. It's not very mobile in the soil. It's tough to move it around, but it's also tough to change soil test. So because of that, this strikes me as a little bit of a concern. If potassium levels are going down, it's harder to bring them back up. Now, part of what I think is happening here is, I've seen it through the years, right? You go into the ag retailer and you say, all right, I'm going to grow 200 bushel corn, 60 bushel beans. That's my yield goal this year. Spread 2 years of fertilizer in front of my corn. Perfect. Get your fertilizer spread, you raise 220 bushel corn. How many of you after harvest call your egg retailer and go, whew, I went 20 bushel over budget, get the fertilizer buggy out here and replace that for my beans? We don't, right? We go, beans are scavengers, they'll be fine. So 2 years later, you come back and go, my yield goal's 200 bushels, 60 bushel beans. You put that fertilizer out there, you raise 230 bushel corn and 70 bushel beans. You're getting behind, right? Because you're not going out there. So in order to stop this trend, we're going to have to go out and spread potash before every crop. Now, we've seen in PFR that that's profitable to do because soybeans love potash, right? So that's profitable to do, but it also lets you make your year-to-year adjustments based on, one, your yield goal, and two, the yield you took off based on your crop removal rates. Potassium. So corn plants from V4 to V12 can use up to 5 pounds per day. We have got to have it available. We've got to have it mobile in the soil. That's hard to do, but if we get behind on these soil tests, we don't have a lot of options to go, well, I just foliar feed some potassium, or I can put it in with the planter, I can put it in with the side dress, right? It's expensive and hard to do. Now, this also is interesting. I talked about base saturation, right? I want it above 3%. But how many of us pull into a field, and I've done it too, go, man, this is some of my best corn, and it looks good. I'm planning on putting 50 gallon of 28 on it, but man, it looks good today. I'm going to turn that knob to 55. Maybe I'll turn it to 60. And we see a yield response from it. That's why we do that. But think about this. High nitrogen environments can dilute the availability of potash in the soil, potassium. So high yield environments, we have got to offset what you're doing with nitrogen and add more potassium. So that too is causing this separation in our soil testing. CECs. Now I put this up here because I can't really change CECs, right? They're what the good Lord gave us. But you need to know what your CECs are to help you make decisions moving forward. So I like the sponge example. A bigger sponge holds more water, right? So I think about high CECs as a large sponge. They hold a lot of nutrients, okay? They are slower to change soil test, okay? But it's slower to change going down, but it's also slower to change coming up. It takes a lot more fertilizer to move the needle on a high CEC soil. Now I get to the small sponge, the low CECs, or what we have a lot of in southeast Indiana. Our soil tests can change quickly because I can't hold on to as much fertilizer. But I also can change them quickly through lime and through fertilizer application. So in those situations, you are probably better off to go to a 2-year soil sampling on low CEC soils if you're doing 4 normally on your high, because we got to stay ahead of the trends. Again, low CEC soils change value much quicker, so you can get farther out of whack over a 4-year time. All right, we're going to look at sulfur. This one to me, right, is obvious. We've been talking about sulfur. Look at it, it's tanking. But here's what's really interesting to me. Look at the soils that are deficient or low. About 2006, 2007, we had plenty of sulfur still in the soil. So we think about that long period of time from the Clean Air Act, we had a lot of sulfur still in the atmosphere. It was getting cleaned out. And boom, that's when it hit. Look at the steep curve of deficient soils. They just took off all the way up to about 65%. Now, if you actually go back through PFR books and get into 2014, 2015 books, you will see that's about when sulfur started to consistently pay in PFR studies. So the PFR actually matched the trend. Now, we've been talking about sulfur for the last 5 or 6 years, so we've brought those deficient soils down, but man, we've got a long way to go to catch back up. We know sulfur's important. Now, when I started looking at some of the PFR studies, I wanted to see if there was any trends to sulfur. So I look at it in corn. Here I am, in a 2x2, 2x2x2 system. We know the sulfur is important at planting. We know sulfur is important every time you put nitrogen on. Okay, it helps stabilize it, helps that plant use sulfur more efficiently, or nitrogen more efficiently, sorry. And we also know that when we have lower organic matter soils, we don't mineralize as much. We get about 4 pounds of sulfur out of a % organic matter. So I go here to Ohio and I see a much bigger yield increase. Well, there's a lower organic matter soil in this study. So it makes sense, right? That, hey, more sulfur pays bigger in Ohio. Now that's on corn, but I started looking at soybeans because for me, soybeans have been a little bit inconsistent on sulfur. And if we look here at all the results from 2020, they're all positive in terms of yield, but not in terms of ROI. So as I looked at this, I felt like, okay, well, what is the pattern? And what you're going to find in when I go through the talk is that we're finding some patterns through PFR that are really helping us understand what's going on out here in the soil. So I started looking through the individual locations. Again, so we talked about Ohio and the corn. Here's Central Illinois. They saw a 3.5 bushel increase from adding sulfur. Well, I kind of messed up my theory of the organic matter because Ohio has a soil sulfur level of 2. Illinois has one of 11. But Central Illinois has organic matter of 4.6%. Ohio only has 2.3. So to me, well, that kind of messes up my thought process. I got more organic matter here and saw a great response on soybeans. Then I went to Minnesota, our PFR farm up there, and I pulled it up and I said, what's an organic matter of 5.6? Right? I'd never even seen that. So they brought me some cups of dirt down here just so I could see it. Okay? High organic matter, high sulfur level, 3.9. They saw even more response to sulfur on soybeans. I said, well, what's the trend? Well, these are all pre-plant incorporated treatments. What have we been telling you about planting dates on soybeans? Plant them earlier, right? Earlier. We're seeing success. Perfect, right? Well, what happens if soil is cold and wet? Can it mineralize sulfur? No, right? So it needs that sulfur earlier. AMS is highly available sulfur when we put it on. So if you're planting early in cooler soils, I'd say wetter too, but we don't plant in wet soils, right? Just cooler soils. We see a more consistent response out of sulfur on soybeans. So again, PFR is not only teaching us what nutrient do we need and when, but also the why and the how. Look at this. This one's interesting to me. The boron. Look at it. It's almost following the same pattern as sulfur. 65% of soils testing deficient. Boron is going down. So I think about this, again, the wooden staves on this bucket and holding water. NP and K's up here. We fixed sulfur. Now boron looks to be the next one. And I looked at this and said, well, what's happened here? So I go back to Ronald Reagan. I'm here from the government and I'm here to help, right? The scary words. Boron was tied to that sulfur in the Clean Air Act, and we didn't realize it. You have to actually go back to 1984 to find some research that was done on it. But there was boron in the atmosphere. So when we pulled all that out, we pulled boron and didn't really even realize it. So we've lost the boron from the atmosphere. Now, we've always known that boron is extremely important in pollination, in flower set, kernel set, things like that in corn, right? It's important early, and you see that by the uptake curve. 65% of boron is taken up early. Doesn't take a lot of boron, but it's important early on. But look at the second kind of jump there. Right during grain fill, there's a huge demand for boron. So I said, okay, well, let's see what's been happening in PFR. This is what kind of really was interesting. Think about PFR Proven. You all know what that is, right? 3 years increased yield, 3 years of increased profitability. We know that. We also know that in fungicides, right, we have a lot of fungicides that are PFR proven, a lot of brand names. But when you step back and go, why? Why are all those fungicides PFR proven? Every one of them is multiple modes of action. Pop-up fertilizer for a planter, the only ones PFR proven are the ones that contain potassium. So we're seeing these interesting trends in PFR. So I look at this boron and I say, okay, we have nothing PFR proven for boron as an early application. We must be getting enough out of the soil. All these are at tassel time and grain fill time. That tells me that second wave of boron, we're not getting enough. And that's where boron applications are profitable. VT timing on corn, we're loading that plant up with boron right before it goes into grain fill. R3 on soybeans, same deal. Start of grain fill, bigger beans, bigger kernels, more weight. PFR is teaching us that we need boron at grain fill time. Okay, not so much that these products themselves are PFR proven, they're great products, but it's the fact that it's boron at grain fill time. And to me, that is setting a new wave of PFR and what we're going to learn from it. So manganese, right? I talked about how the pH is changing. So some nutrients become more available, some become less available. Well, manganese is actually becoming more available. So then I thought, well, okay, in PFR, then maybe it doesn't work. But look here. Look at the curve, the uptake curve of magnesium, right? It's all year long. So those are some of the deficiency symptoms. So I looked at it and go, wow, $33 and $58 profitability? That's pretty impressive. But again, here's what PFR's taught us. Both of those applications are at V4. Both of those are just manganese products. So what that tells me is soybeans need manganese at V4, right? These are great products, but PFR's shown us we need manganese at V4. That's when that plant needs it. That's when we see the biggest response. So again, as we watch these trends in PFR Proven, I think there's some neat things we're learning. Zinc, it's slightly going down, but you'll see over 50% of the soils are deficient in it. So is this kind of that next stave on that barrel, right, as we keep moving down? So let's look at PFR. On corn, you'll see I go back to the 2x2x2 treatments. It's interesting what doors this system is opening up for us. But we're adding a quart of zinc up front and seeing huge returns. Now, it's interesting to me because high phosphorus soils need more zinc, right, to offset that. So growing up on a hog farm, having soil tests that were high in phosphorus, zinc was important to us. But I hadn't thought about it in the grand scheme of things. But we see the soil test trends are going down, and the profitability is going up by using those products in PFR. Magnesium, it stayed kind of flat. It just really hasn't changed. Its sweet spot on the pH scale is much larger. But this here, I think, is interesting. Nutrient packs, foliar feeds on soybeans containing zinc and magnesium have all shown profitability. That whole suite of nutrients at that time, at this R1, has really set us up for success. And so I think about that and I go, well, it's manganese early, it's these things late. Why is that? Well, think about this trifoliate on the soybeans, the 3 leaves. And they go down the petiole to the stem. They're attached at a node, right, where the flowers and the pods are. Excuse me. And I think of that as a grain bin. It's storing nutrients to transfer to feed that node. That's how trifoliate's job. So if I end up having a full grain bin at that time, but I can come in here with a nutrient pack and cone it out, I've got that many more nutrients to feed that seed, and it has everything it needs to be the biggest it can be and not abort anything. So that's kind of our goal there. All right, copper. Copper is going down. We're not showing any deficiencies in the soil yet, but copper is dropping. What effect does this have on us? Well, when I think about like organic growers and things like that, I have a lot of them use copper for plant health. So they use it almost as a replacement for fungicide. So as we spray more and more fungicides and we have more disease, is that a correlation to this? I can't prove that, but it may be. So will copper become one of those things we need to start looking at in a foliar feed to help offset disease, help strengthen the immune system of our plants? But something's going to happen here, right? It's going down. We know we need that nutrient. Disease control is the one correlation. Iron is actually going up. Again, as soil tests change, some things become more available. Now, this to me is interesting. Again, we go back to this PFR Proven products, and we talked about in soybeans that V4 is manganese, right? But if I jump down to the second group of columns, the R1 to R3, those are all nutrient packs. They all contain zinc. They all contain manganese. Some of them contain boron. Most of them contain sulfur. So again, it's loading that trifoliate up with everything it needs right before grain fill. That is where the strength is in it. So PFR has taught us some kind of fun things from that standpoint that are helping us stay ahead of the soil test trends. But I need you to think about, in your operation, taking your soil test, looking at what your trends are. Taking the chance to pay a little extra, pull the extra samples to get your sulfur, your zinc, and those other nutrients. Know where you're at. Because we're learning through PFR which products and when to use. And to me, I think that's extremely important, extremely valuable, right? We take those take that information and we can apply it. We're doing the testing for you, right? So we're going to learn. We're taking the time to analyze it and be successful. So we're going to help you find the yield limiting factors on your farm through your soil test. Well, I appreciate you guys coming in. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your business and support of Beck's. It's a lot of fun for me to come and speak to a big crowd. So thank you. Enjoy the show, and I'll be up here if you have any other questions.